Good morning and welcome to the third meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2025. Before we begin, can you please ensure that all electronic devices are switched to silent? I wish to inform committee members that Colin Beattie has resigned his membership of the committee, so we thank Colin for his contribution to the committee's scrutiny work. We will have a new member next week. Also this morning I'd like to welcome Jackie Bailey, who will be taking part in agenda item 1 and 2. So our first item of business is consideration of negative SSI, the Conservation of Salmon Miscellaneous Amendment, Scotland Regulation 2024. And I welcome to the meeting remotely Mary Goujon, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands, and also welcome in person the Cabinet Secretary's officials. We've got Annette Branding, the from Marine Environment, Dr John Armstrong and Dr Stuart Middlemas, Science, Evidence, Data, Digital section of Marine Directorate. So before we begin, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement?
Just to say good morning to the convener and the committee members, and thank you for the opportunity this morning to discuss the Salmon Regulations 2024 and to outline the vital importance of these regulations to protect and conserve this iconic species. I think first and foremost, I just want to make clear that these regulations are designed to manage the exploitation of salmon sustainably, and the regulations allow anglers to pursue their hobby and enable fishery owners to earn an income from selling fishing permits. Now, these regulations are key to delivering the wild salmon strategy. The Scottish rivers have healthy populations of wild salmon, the wild salmon management is evidence-based, and that the environmental and socio-economic benefits arising from wild salmon are maximised too. And using the best available data, the Marine Directorate scientists have identified, as they have done in previous years since 2016, those river systems where salmon are most at risk and where they need protection through mandatory catch and release. Now, I realise that some can see that as a deterrent for anglers and they're worried that income from selling fishing permits can decrease. But I think what we do see is the opposite of that. The majority of anglers in Scotland have long recognised that the health of our salmon stocks is more fragile than ever, and that's why we see many areas are already operating a voluntary catch and release regime like that we see practised on the River Dee, and they've been practising that for the past 30 years. And more recently, the River Tweed voted unanimously for the introduction of the same approach. So overall, the rate of catch and release for wild salmon practice in Scotland has actually steadily increased in past years and was at 96% in 2023. And I think that just really reflects the forward-thinking nature of those enjoying fishing for salmon. However, the wild salmon strategy and the associated implementation plan don't just focus on anglers alone. That they also aim to tackle the wide range of pressures in the river and at the coast over which we do have some control, and the delivery of the wild salmon strategy really depends critically on actions taken both at a national and at a local level by government as well as fishery managers and anglers. The conservation regulations and associated gradings use the best available evidence and data that we have, and in the case of the River Endrick, catches have declined in recent years and the proposed mandatory catch and release is required to support the recovery of stocks in the river. We can't allocate gradings to rivers that don't reflect the data that we have on salmon, because I think that would set quite a dangerous precedent not to provide the salmon in the River Endrick Special Area of Conservation with the protection that they need. And in closing, convener, I would just want to say that I believe these regulations are a very much needed contribution in our collective efforts to try and reverse the fortune of wild salmon, because they are such a magnificent species and really iconic for Scotland. So it is therefore our duty to try and conserve our wild populations for future generations.
Thank you, the Cabinet Secretary. Whilst I think I speak for the committee when I say that we do have a strong desire to do everything that's possible to protect what we regard as an iconic species. However, there is annual debate over this instrument. Whilst we know it's in place to protect salmon, there's always arguments about how the data is collected and how it's analysed. Are you comfortable that, unlike maybe 5 or 6 years ago where there was real concerns over the methodology, we're getting the modelling and the data collection right to ensure that the river gradings are accurate?
Yeah, I do believe that we are using the best available data that we have, but of course, where there are improvements to be made to that, we always would consider that too. And I'm sure officials can give a bit more detail on the methodology that's used. But I mean, primarily we use all the data that's provided to us through the statutory catch return forms as well. And I think in terms of the methodology that we're using, some of that is going to be peer reviewed too. But I think that, again, I would want to say as well that we're open to receiving information from the fisheries themselves. And in fact, I think a couple of the rivers that had been assessed, their assessment was changed on the back of further information that we received. So that dialogue and the further information we get, we do carefully consider. But I'll hand over to officials who'll be able to say a bit more about the methodology that's used if the committee would find that helpful.
Thank you.
The methodology we've got, part of it's in peer review at the moment, so we're waiting for the outcome of that. But it's not. It's been scrutinised by lots of people. It's based on international standard methods, but tailored to Scottish needs and Scottish data, and it's used by groups such as the ICES Working Group on North Atlantic salmon. So it's accepted by them that this is the method Scotland used. So it's not that. There has been no scrutiny over this. This has been scrutinised a lot. It's been scrutinised a lot more than most things that go to peer review and have been through peer review. So while it's true, as Cabinet Secretary said, methods can always be improved, but we have to use the best available methods and the best available science that we have. And we are doing that, but that's not to say we're not working in the background to update the methods. One thing I would say is that we're not... We want to keep the methods stable from feedback from the committee and anglers, so we don't want to change the methods every year. So it looks like nothing's changing and we're not working on it. But the idea is to develop it to such a stage and then consult and bring changes in at one time. So it just means there's not kind of big changes year on year that makes it difficult to plan for fisheries.
Yeah. Elena.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary. Just a quick question from me, Cabinet Secretary. If the motion was passed to annul this instrument today, what would be the effect of that?
I would be really concerned if the motion to annul was passed, primarily because that would mean that the regulations that were passed in 2023 would apply here. Now, some of the changes that we're introducing through the regulations that the committee have before them today, we've seen 12 river systems that have fallen one grade and 9 that are subject to mandatory catch and release, and 4 actually rise one grade and 3 no longer have the mandatory catch and release. So that wouldn't apply because, again, we'd be relying on the regulations that were passed in 2023. And ultimately that would mean that in some of those rivers, that would mean then that there would be killing of rod caught fish. And again, given the precarious state of the species at the moment, that's where I would be seriously concerned if the motion to annul was passed by the committee.
Just on the back of that, is there any evidence that there is widespread killing of fish? Or is it a sort of taken that no matter the grading of the river, anglers are as conscious as anybody about the precarious position salmon is, and they're actually catch and release whatever the status of the river is? Is that not the kind of adopted practice now?
Oh, absolutely, Convener. I think what you've said there is right, and I think I alluded to that in my opening comments as well, and mentioned some of the rivers that have been practising that for a long time anyway. But again, we do need these regulations in place. I think, given the evidence and the data that we have, and the assessments that we've undertaken that show that the status of the populations has changed in some areas. And again, it's and as I say, it's not just all about some rivers going down a level, others are also moving up, which means that mandatory catch and release wouldn't be in place for some rivers. But I do believe absolutely that anglers genuinely want to try and do the right thing for the species, and I think it's within everybody's best interest for that. But again, I think that's why it's really important that the motion to annul isn't passed by the committee today, because I think we need to work on the best available evidence and data that we have, which is what has been put forward and why we're amending the regulations in the way that we are today.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant.
Yeah.
an awful lot of nearly half of the respondents are concerned about how data is collected. So can I ask what proportion of data do you receive back from owners of the different beats? So what proportion are actually submitting returns? And when they don't submit returns, what do you do with that lack of data?
I'll ask officials to come in on some of those specific points, and Booth will have more of the detailed information.
So primarily it's catch returns, and we send out over 2,000 forms a year. We follow those up. If we don't get initial response, we follow those up with kind of reminder letters, and we get about over 90% return rates, and that's been fairly stable. I think it's 93. I can find the exact figures and let the committee know, but it's certainly kind of 92, 93% return rates from that. Generally, we believe, well, a lot of the people that don't get back tend to be areas that we've not heard from for a number of years and where we believe there's not significant fisheries. But it's difficult to chase too much into that. You write to every fishery on every river and ask them for their returns, and you chase up, and then you get 90% back eventually. So we've got a kind of database essentially of all kind of fisheries, of all active fisheries, and they're written to every year. There are some fisheries we note as kind of dormant, but we kind of check to make sure they're still dormant fisheries. So not all fisheries are active fisheries. Not all fisheries fish. Some have never fished. The fishing's maybe not been particularly good, and some do it for conservation grounds, etc. But yes, we kind of check on all of those kind of dormant fisheries periodically, and we write to the fisheries to get a return every year. Yes. So just to be clear, you get 90% return on the fisheries you believe fish, not all fisheries. That's 90% of the kind of forms we send out. We get back. Yeah, but you don't send forms to every fishery, because you don't send forms to those that you believe are dormant. We do check the dormant status. I'd need to double check the exact procedure because it's changed over the years, but we do check the dormant kind of dormancy of fisheries as well. I believe it used to be every few years, but again, I'll need to come back because it's not my department. Okay. Sorry to not answer the question. I'm struggling to remember, but rather than give you false information, we can provide that information for you. That would be useful. Thank you.
Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Just note in the submission from Fisheries Management Scotland that we got, Cabinet Secretary, that it says here that the River Annan is one of only 2 rivers in Schedule 1 in which there is not a set period in the early part of the year during the annual close time in which fishing by rod and line is permitted. And also that, I know it is important to support conservation of wild salmon, but in the Fisheries Management Scotland submission, they say that if the instrument is annulled, it would mean that the fishery on the River Annan would not be permitted to operate between the 25th of February and the 31st of March. And that would have a significant impact on the local economy. So I'm interested in any wider numbers around the impact on the local economy, for instance, because we know that it is really important to conserve the wild salmon, because we've heard a lot about that in recent months, but I'm interested in the wider impact on the local economy if this instrument was annulled.
Thank you for the question, because I think you touched on a really important point there, particularly in relation to the River Annan, and you're absolutely right in terms of what Fisheries Management Scotland have highlighted in that, and it would be a big economic impact, particularly in that area, again, if the motion to annul was passed, because it would mean that the early season would be unlawful, which would have a significant impact there. So again, that's another really vital reason why the regulations need to proceed, and I hope that the motion isn't supported today.
And my understanding is that some of the fisherwomen, fisher people are only fishing on the River Annan, so that means that they would not be able to catch and release at all then anywhere if this motion was annulled. Is that correct?
Again, it would make that early season unlawful, so that wouldn't be able to take place. I don't know if there's any further information on the specifics around that as well, and in relation to the economic impact that you mentioned in your first question. I would say that we do publish, of course, a BRIA and the Business Regulatory Impact Assessment as part of the regulations too, that picks up on some of that, but I think I would be really concerned at the impact on the Annan, as well as the wider issues of wild salmon conservation, if the regulations weren't to go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
I think one of the difficulties is that the instrument has two parts to it, and annulling, if we don't like the part that sets the categories of the river, by default we're also rejecting what would appear to be a move we would welcome, which is the amending the annual closure times, which would have an impact in Annan. So it's rather difficult to look at these and consider annulling, because it has a potential unintended consequence, and something that the committee would, in the face of it, support. I've just got one further question before I'm going to move to Jackie Bailey. In the past, one of the concerns was about the methodology and the data that was collected, and the data is only as good as the people who are providing it to you. And one of the commitments from a few years back, I think it's when the Clare Committee dealt with this, was to have more fish counters on our rivers, which would take away some of the uncertainty over fishing effort, looking at how many people actually been fishing the river, and bring into the sort of model whether salmon had actually entered the river, and whether that's got to do with a dry summer or exceptionally high tides, or a whole range of different things that affect fish coming to the river. Have we seen an increase in fish counters, which would mean that some of the uncertainty over fishing effort and so on might be taken out of it, and we actually know the number of fish that are entering a river?
Yeah, I'm sure officials can provide more of the detail in relation to that. What I would say is that, when it comes to wild salmon conservation, obviously there is, there are a number of pieces of work underway. I mentioned in my opening comments about the wild salmon strategy and the implementation on the back of that. And we've invested, I think, nearly £5 million over the course of the past few years in relation to the actions on that. And I think part of that has also included the counter network. But again, officials will be able to provide more information.
Anyone would like to take that one on?
I'll start, and other people can help. We working with kind of partners in the local kind of trust network, and also the Atlantic Salmon Trust. There's 2 counters being put in the River Laxford in North West Scotland, the River Devon in the kind of Grampian area, and those information from those was used last year in the conservation regulations for those rivers, but we're also studying the results from those to apply them elsewhere. So they're starting to get more information from a wider number of areas, and there's also discussions happening for a counter to go in the Western Isles, for example, and I think funding has been provided to local groups for other counters, including one to go on the North Esk.
Can I just to say, of course, fish counters, both the purchase and the operation of it is very costly and time-consuming and resource-consuming. So the Marine Fund Scotland has provided funding, for example, last year again, for fish counters to be installed. and More Earned funded that for District Salmon Fishery Board and angling trusts and angling associations to be given those fish counters. But at the same time, we are also funding pilots to actually explore the use of artificial intelligence so that the counting and the data can be automatically assessed and then be used in our assessment methodologies. So this is an area where I think we've seen a lot of innovation that will help in the future to achieve more automation and also to ensure that we can have a counter network that is widespread and fit for purpose to underpin not just the conservation regulations but all of our efforts for salmon conservation.
Okay, thanks. I've got Tim and then Ariane.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was actually quite helpful, and good morning, by the way, to the Cabinet Secretary and yourselves for coming in. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind this is a pretty iconic species, isn't it? And we want it to be protected. Now, I've not actually seen this regulations before, so I'm pretty new to this committee. But it's funny, I just had an email ping in there while Dr. Middlemass was speaking. But there seems to be some issues, doesn't there? And I think it was touched on earlier with the data, how we collect it, and then how we utilise that. So can you just for clarity again, can I just ask you to go back on what is the promise? Moving forward, if we agree this today, how do we make these regulations better? How do we make that sure that data collection really is ensuring the right outcome on our rivers in terms of closed periods, etc., etc.?
I think you do raise a really important point because, you know, as we've said already, we work on the best available data that we have, but of course, wherever that can be improved, we would look to do that. You've just heard the investment there that's taken place in the counter network. And I do think that, as Dr. Middlemass had touched on earlier as well, part of the methodology that we used is going to be peer reviewed going forward. But I think he also pointed out that the way that the methodology is undertaken and how we use the data that we have holds up internationally as well. But of course, we look forward to the outcome of the peer review process. And of course, where there are recommendations or, you know, where other areas of improvement, then of course we would like to consider that.
Okay, fine.
Okay, Ariane.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and good morning, officials. I actually want to follow on from Tim Eagle's question because in the kind of opening there, Dr. Middlemass, you talked about the fact that there's change being developed in the background, and I think maybe the counters is part of that, but I just wonder, again, it's kind of like, I liked Tim's phrase, that what's the promise? Could you explain a little bit about the work they are doing in the background that what I understand is going to then be rolled out in a package in some way in the future so that we're not coming back to this issue? So can you just tell us a little bit about that?
So part of it's about updating. There's essentially two parts to the whole process broken down. It's very complicated. There's lots of mathematical modelling, but if we break it down simply, it's how many fish do you have and how many fish do you need? And those are two difficult questions to answer, but we're working on kind of both of those. So the counters give us information on how many we have, which is very useful, and we can use the relationship between catches and counters to get an idea of how many we have in areas without rivers. So we're working on that. We're working with the new information from the new counters, but we're also working on trying to incorporate information on effort. Scotland traditionally didn't collect information on fishing effort, so the amount of rod days we have it as. And that's been started to collect that in 2019. So we're working on incorporating that because I think people would really, it's easy to understand that the amount of fishing effort will affect the kind of rod catch. So we want to incorporate that into the assessment. So we're working with the data. Unfortunately, it takes time to collect the data and have enough of the data to put that into a usable format. But that's what we're working on that side. On the how many do we need, we're hoping to be able to do that as near as possible on a kind of river by river basis. Once we have enough years, we've started collecting that river by river base information in 2011, and I'm not I'm not going to bore people with the mathematics and the kind of stock recruitment and all these kind of things, but essentially we need a long time series before we can use that information to say, well, this is the numbers that you need to compare it to the numbers you have. So we're hoping to do that on a kind of river by river basis. So we would have, instead of kind of knowing it for some rivers and having to extrapolate for others, we would have it for kind of most rivers. Again, that takes time. We need the data for that, and we need the time series. So that's something that's being developed as well. So hopefully when we have that together as a package, then we will have a kind of this step forward. So it would improve us. The best available information would be better, more kind of based on the best use of local information. That's not to say we're not using the best use of local information at the moment. It's just that we're not able to turn that into, or yet turn that into something that could be used for the conservation regulations without further work. So that's where we're aiming to get to.
Okay, and when you say, you've said it's in a number, around effort is going to take time, around the river by river basis it's going to take time. So what's that time? A few years?
We will hopefully be able to report on certainly progress towards that in a year, maybe 2 years, I would think, to get that done. Again, it mightn't be that we can't have the answer then, but we should be able to report on progress and say, here's how we've done and here's how what the kind of prognosis is for the next couple of years.
Okay, thanks very much.
Maybe worth adding that things are changing with salmon. They're getting smaller. It's not just the numbers that are decreasing. And smaller salmon have fewer eggs. So understanding changes in the size of the fish is really quite important, or very important. And there's now a process in place to get better information on how size is changing with time. So this is an important component of the assessment. And it'll be an ongoing process. So that we won't just reach an endpoint. We need to carry on counting fish and looking at these changes.
Okay, thank you.
Tim Eagle.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that, Dr. Middlemas. I guess the problem is when you can just keep going with data, can't you? Just constantly collecting, and then not doing. And I was just looking there at the Salmon Interactions Working Group report, which is obviously between wild and farm salmon. I think only one of those recommendations has been completed, is it not? So I guess that's the answer. Like 2 years actually sounds like quite a long period of time. I think you said at the end there. So is there any way of speeding that up? Because actually what we want to see is this species recovering and better management of it. And my worry would be we're just going to delay and delay where we get more and more data and not actually push forward.
I think it's really difficult. So if it's dependent on for the data collection, we're dependent on people going out fishing and getting information back every year. So if it's data dependent, then it's really difficult to speed things up. If it's kind of people and manpower dependent, then that might be possible, but there's lots of other kind of calls and priorities. So the data thing, you couldn't speed that up because 2019. It's only given us, I guess, we don't have 5 years' worth of effort data yet, for example. So if it turns out we need, 6 or 7, but I guess what I'm saying is we can continually review that, so we can see what we can do now, see what we can do kind of next year, etc. It's not a case that we're sitting there going, we'll need 10 years' worth of data, we won't do anything until we get that. We continually review that and see what can be done at each point.
Okay, so maybe I just picked you up wrong, but it was that, because obviously we have had some interaction with people that are saying, actually, we're not sure how the information we're feeding back to you guys is being utilised in terms of this regulation. And then we're talking about fish counters, and that actually sounds quite promising, but actually we probably need to roll out more of those. But it's actually, again, all of this has got to feed in, ultimately, hasn't it, to the protection of the species, and we're seeing more. And actually, how do we do that? And how do we actually get that stuff done on the ground?
And the fish counters is a good one, because we'll be able to show that the work that was done on the Devon and Laxford were able to feed that in directly to the regulations. So the people on the ground were able to see that, you know, having the fish counter made a direct impact and fed directly into the assessments.
Again, I suppose it's really a question for the Cabinet Secretary. Where on your list of priorities does protection of wild salmon come? You know, particularly in light of what Tim Eagles just mentioned, that we've only had one of the 42 recommendations, and that's been in place some time. Just looking at correspondence we had in 2020, where stakeholders have voiced they're disappointed in the progress. So are you confident we're making enough progress? Is it high enough a priority? Are we putting enough effort and resources into protecting our wild salmon?
Yes, it is a high priority. But what I would say is you can't just look at that piece of work in isolation, because I've already touched on today the wild salmon strategy and the wild salmon implementation plan. And if it would be helpful for the committee, I'm happy to write with further information as to the progress of those, because we know that there are a number of pressures that are facing our wild salmon, and it's important that we take action against each of those pressures. So this isn't a case of doing one piece of work; it's trying to take action across the piece and where we can do that and where it's within our power to do it. And I think, you know, Tim Eagle touched on an important point in relation to the Salmon Interaction Working Group report, and the key focus of that. There have been a few recommendations that are taken forward, identifying SEPA as the key regulator, but also implementing the SEPA Sea Lice framework. I don't think you can underestimate just how much work has been involved in developing that framework, then leading to the implementation as part of that. But again, I'm happy to provide the committee with more information in relation to that, as to the work that's ongoing at the moment, what's already been undertaken to ensure that the committee has the most up-to-date information.
I've got a brief supplementary from Marianne Burgess, and then I'm going to move to Jackie Bailey.
Thanks, Convener. Just following on your kind of bigger picture question about protecting wild salmon, and thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for mentioning the wild salmon strategy and the implementation plan. I think that would be good to see. At the beginning, you opened with a statement, and you said that it's designed to regulate the exploitation of wild salmon. And I just wonder if maybe we need to have a reflection on that. If we're talking about protecting wild salmon, maybe we need to change our language around that and actually talk about things that are designed to regenerate our wild salmon rather than protect it from exploitation. And maybe, you know, language is quite important. And what I notice from sitting on this committee is we talk a lot about exploiting Scotland's nature, wild salmon, whatever, and actually other animals, and maybe actually moving towards this idea of regeneration, like we're talking about regenerative agriculture now, would be a good shift, and it would help us understand what we're really trying to do here is regenerate a species rather than protect what little is left.
No, I completely appreciate your point. And what I would say is that, you know, that word being used specifically is in relation to these regulations. But when exactly the point you're talking about there, you know, it's not just about exploitation, it's about how we recover the species. You know, that's exactly where we want to be. It's such an iconic species for Scotland. We want to see the populations grow and enhance and reverse some of the trends that we've seen. And I think that would be the ultimate goal. But again, that work is broadly covered by what we're trying to achieve across the wild salmon strategy, because we know there isn't one single issue that's causing the decline in populations. It's multifaceted, which means that we need that broader approach. But again, hopefully if I could provide that information to the committee, you would find that helpful to see the action that we're taking across a number of different areas to try and address these pressures where they exist.
Thank you, Convener. I wonder whether I could ask just a number of particular questions about the NDRIC. Can I ask either the Cabinet Secretary or her officials, do you yet know how many riparian owners there are on the NDRIC?
I'll ask officials to come in specifically on that point. I think in relation to, I know we've had correspondence on this previously, I think we've been aware of 18 fisheries, and I think we'd asked the Loch Lomond Angling Improvement Association to provide us with further information if that information wasn't correct, which we haven't quite received. So I don't know if that's changed in the interim, but I don't know if officials have any further information to that.
just a little bit of background and for the committee. It's not the riparian owners, it's the fishery owners, I think Loch Lomond Anglo Association mean. Right, just because you own the ground doesn't mean you have the fishing rights, but that's just a point so people will kind of understand the background. But we do have the kind of 18 fishery owners. We have increased that since the last committee discussion about this, with information from the Loch Lomond Anglo Association. We've also approached Registrars of Scotland, who, in discussion with them, it's not clear that exactly what we would get from their process. They said it wasn't. You know, we might not necessarily get what we're looking for by going through their process, was what they said to us. So I think...
So the suggestion made to me is that the data on the number of owners, whether you call them fisheries or anything else, is incomplete.
And we've updated that with the information we've got from the... I think it was in 2017, 2018.
It was 2017.
So, and that is as complete a record as we have at the moment, using all the information that was provided by the locals.
Sure, absolutely, and they know, but of course 8 years have since passed and there's been no update or attempt to complete that data set. Can I move on to asking about how many returns you've received from these fisheries, and what enforcement action have you taken, if any, where they don't return catch data?
So, we have returns, and we have a note whether the fisheries are active, and there's a number of kind of active fisheries. So it's not just the Loch Lomond Angling Improvement Association that provide us with catch returns. So we can provide, I think we've provided you in the letter from the Cabinet Secretary that information, which is somewhere...
But not all of them provide catch returns?
In the, no, there's many of them are not active fisheries.
Okay.
That
Some are
sense.
active fisheries. In the instance where it's active fisheries, can I ask, is there, I understand what you said to my colleague earlier about a series of letters, is there any enforcement action taken if people don't provide returns and they are active fisheries?
We get a lot of zero returns for the NREC, but no, there's no enforcement action. Once we get to the end of that process, there's not been any enforcement action taken.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just also maybe just provide some further clarification? Marine Directorate critically depends on the collaboration locally of fisheries, of district salmon fishery boards and trusts and angling associations. So we really rely on them providing quite a lot of information to us, so that Loch Lomond Angling Improvement Association is employing bailiffs. And the bailiffs will actually have quite a lot of information about where fishing takes place, where also, of course, poaching takes place. And we would be really welcoming if the Loch Lomond Angling Improvement Association has further data on where fisheries have indicated to us as being dormant are actually active, because they have the best information at hand. We in Marine Directorate can't actually have that oversight and that detailed knowledge. We don't have bailiffs on the ground that actually monitor all of the angling activities. So that's why the engagement with angling associations and boards and trusts are so important, that they help us to provide the information so that our records can be up to date and adequately reflect what's going on the ground.
They've been trying to do that, Convener, for years.
Have you any further questions?
No, thank you, Convener.
Can I just... I think it's raised a point with me. When there's a lack of robust evidence or data relating to a river, what action do you take at that point before making a decision? And what's the default position if you come to the conclusion that there is not robust or significant evidence to base a decision on?
Can I just say, first of all, I think officials might want to come in with more information, but I think it's quite important that the process that we follow in terms of what we set out. So again, as we've said throughout the session so far this morning, we base it on the best available science and information that we have. We then go out to consultation. As Antje mentioned, there's also that regular engagement with the fisheries boards and trusts as well. And I think it is really important to point out that we rely on that information, but we also act on that information too, because on the back of that, as I touched on earlier, there were 2 instances recently where the classifications were changed as a result of extra information that we'd had, or where there were concerns about the data that had been received, and we get that extra information. Again, I'm not aware that we've been in receipt. I know that officials have had meetings with the Loch Lomond Angling Improvement Association, and there have been those requests for further information. As far as I'm aware, that hadn't been received. But I think I just want to be clear on the process and to show that, you know, we do engage and we do listen to that way that is available.
I guess it's in practice, who makes the decision as to whether the data received is sufficient or robust enough to base a classification on, and if it's not, what then happens? I know you're saying you make efforts to then contact, but at what point does someone decide that the data is not sufficient enough to base a decision on, and what happens after that?
I think with the conservation regulations, it's set up so the default is essentially no retaining fish. So because it's a conservation measure, the default is to protect the fish. So if there's not sufficient information, it will essentially be the same as categorising in poor conservation status, grade 3, and there'll be no retention. So it's only sufficient information to allow retention to happen is the way it should be looked at, rather than the information to prevent the retention happening.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. Members got any other further questions? No. So we now move on to the formal consideration of the motion to annul the instrument. Excuse me. And I invite Jackie Bailey to speak to and move motion S6M 16130 that the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee recommends that the Conservation of Salmon Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulation 2024 be annulled.
Thank you very much, Convener. And I am grateful to you and the committee for affording me time this morning to speak to the Conservation of Salmon Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulations 2024. Let me start, just to get it out the way, by moving the motion to annul the regulations. And I have to say I do so with a heavy heart, because I believe that everyone round this table shares a desire to conserve and, dare I say it, regenerate salmon stocks in Scottish rivers, whether it's the Cabinet Secretary or indeed to the anglers in my constituency. But we need to do so on the basis of accurate data. Those of you who know me will also appreciate that this is not my specialist subject. However, this is not the first time I've had to raise concerns from my local community about a similar set of regulations. And in this context, I've been approached by the Loch Lomond Angling Improvement Association, an organisation in my constituency that I believe is approaching its centenary. So I think it's safe to say they know the local rivers well. Now, my first such outing on this subject, I think, was back in 2017, and then before committee in March 2018. In that case, it was the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee, of which the convener was a member, and the story is remarkably similar. Indeed, it feels a little like Groundhog Day. So for 8 years, the situation in terms of data has not improved. And let me be absolutely clear, it's not the methodology. It's the data that is gathered and used as the basis for this. Now, the Cabinet Secretary promised best use of the information and the data. We've been providing local information since 2016-17, but it doesn't really appear to have been taken on board. Back in 2017, the issue again was the lack of data, the lack of evidence on which similar regulations were based, and here we are, roll forward 8 years, a new set of regulations, yet the problems with the lack of data remain. Loch Lomond Angling Association are not shy. They have been in dialogue with the government for a long time now. So to suggest that they aren't providing information, I think, is slightly remiss. Let me say at the outset that the association have no desire to stop the provisions that relate to the Annan Salmon Fishery District, nor do they wish to make criticism, object or endorse proposals for any other rivers and their catchment areas, because we don't know the detail of that. But I do, however, note that 46% of respondents to the consultation had concerns about the data used by the Marine Directorate. The association's concerns relate specifically to the Endrick Water Special Area of Conservation, which is linked to the adjoining Loch Lomond catchment area. This was first raised by them back in 2016. There followed meetings with Marine Directorate officials. There followed letters to the Cabinet Secretary over the years, and most recently the association had emailed officials about these regulations, which resulted in a meeting in October 2024. The Cabinet Secretary is aware I wrote to her on 2 occasions in November and December 2024, outlining the concerns in the hope that they would be listened to and an amendment made to the regulations before publication. Now let me take a second to note that the association don't allow salmon to be retained until the 1st of May, and for the whole month of October, to protect spring salmon, to protect fish nearing spawning, and to protect late-running fish. That's more than is required by statute. So they're not about stopping the conservation or regeneration of salmon, quite the contrary, as their practices demonstrate. So let me get to the heart of the problem, and that is the data or lack thereof. The Cabinet Secretary rightly talked about best evidence and data, but the best evidence and data in this respect is poor. The association report data on salmon catches on the stretches of the Endrick Water in their ownership. Until 2017, the Marine Directorate did not appear to have much knowledge of the fishery owners on other stretches of the Endrick. The association helped by supplying that information, but it's clear from the earlier evidence that the Marine Directorate don't know all the fisheries that are operating, and the data is therefore incomplete. Unfortunately, very few of the fishery owners are supplying catch information, despite this being an existing legislative requirement, and I'm clear for the evidence that the committee have just heard that there is no enforcement action in place for those who don't. An FOI revealed that in 2016, only 2 returns of catch data were submitted by fishery owners, one of them being the Loch Lomond Angling Improvement Association. In 2017, it was 3, one of them being the association. So there are many more fishery owners on the Endrick, and the Marine Directorate does not appear to have pursued them for catch data. The association also contests that nil catches were declared. The association's water bailiffs have seen and recorded catches from other stretches of the Endrick, not in the association's ownership, where owners have declared nil returns. All of this information has been shared in great detail with the Marine Directorate since 2016, right up to date, but it doesn't appear to have resulted in any substantial change. I'm interested to know if there are any plans to put a counter on the Endrick, given the number of times I have to appear at this committee making the case for local data. Convener, in summary, I understand that 99% of the fish recorded on the Endrick are returned, but the poor grading of the Endrick means Loch Lomond itself, the River Fruin and the River Leven, which are classed as moderate, would drop to poor. That is the detrimental impact of having flawed data. In closing, I ask the committee to invite the government to withdraw the regulations. They can resubmit them, removing the change to grading in the Endrick until they have evidence for that change. They can do so at pace so as not to affect the provisions in the regulations that members support. They've done so with regulations in other circumstances in a matter of days. They should do the right thing here and withdraw the regulations, but if they fail to do so, I hope the committee will support my motion to annul. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Any members wish to debate the motion? Ariane Burgess.
Thanks very much, Convener. I just want to say thank you, Jackie Bailey, for bringing that very thoughtful information. And I think that my sense of what we've heard, and now I don't really fully understand, because we didn't get that in the kind of discussion before, that if we annulled, could the government and the Marine Directorate work at pace to do what my colleague is asking for. But certainly what's come up in the evidence we've been taking is that data is an issue, enforcement is an issue, and action from Marine Directorate is an issue. I am, however, also concerned about the information that we received from Fisheries Management Scotland, and so it's a difficult situation because I feel like I don't have that information about whether a Marine Directorate could take action swiftly enough, because my sense overall is that what this SSI is doing is working to protect Scotland's iconic species. So at this time, I'm minded to vote against the annulment, and that's on the basis of not having enough information.
Thank you, Convener. So I think that was quite telling from Jackie Bailey, I thought, some of the information there which I wasn't aware of. My mind is now whizzing about I'd like to hear actually a response to that, if that's possible, because I think what's your take on that as a Cabinet Secretary and from yourselves here today? And I guess the last point is actually particularly interesting. Actually, does the government have capacity to withdraw this and quickly? Because it's not meant to come into place until the 1st of March, I think. So actually, there is a possibility, is there not, of withdrawing this, making a quick change and then resubmitting, and we probably have the ability to then put it back through this committee. The convener will know more than me. So yeah, I'd be very interested to hear what response there is to that.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks very much, Convener, and I appreciate the discussion and the questions that the committee members have had around that. Now, in terms of withdrawing and resubmitting, I mean, first of all, we'd have to look at the basis of that. Second of all, I'd have to take advice on that to see what the timescales would be, because I think we also can't forget the other part of this regulation, which is about the ANN, which comes into effect and that's for the early season, which is from the 25th of February. And I don't think we would have the time to take this away to resubmit it. But again, what would be the basis for us to do that, and what information are we basing that on? Now, as I mentioned in my comments to committee members, we're aware of 18 fisheries, and we'd updated that information on the back of information that I believe that we had received from Loch Lomond Angling Improvement Association. And again, if there are further evidence that they have that they feel like the information that we have isn't correct. Now, as far as I understand it, we haven't received that further information from the Angling Association in spite of us asking for it. Again, I do have serious concerns if the motion is annulled today. Much of that has been outlined by Fisheries Management Scotland because it affects a number of rivers. As I've already mentioned earlier, 12 are due to be downgraded, but it also affects the 3 who would no longer have mandatory catch and release, as well as the impact that there would be on the River Annan and the economic impact there would be if that wasn't implemented. So that's where I would urge the committee not to support the motion to annul today. Again, we are working on the best available evidence that we have, and it really is vital that these regulations proceed.
Rhoda Grant.
Just the Cabinet Secretary confirmed earlier that in spite of the regulations, most anglers are now using catch and release as the norm, whether or not they are forced to by legislation. And it seems to me that this is not the first time, certainly on this subject and on other subjects as well, we've been presented with instruments where the data and information provided does not stack up, and we're being told by government, because we're on a timescale, that we need to accept it, and it seems nothing changes. So I think we as a committee need to take a stand to make sure that the evidence and information we're getting to back up statutory instruments, which are legislation, actually merit the acceptance of that legislation.
Thank you. Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. This is just a general comment. Colleagues have already mentioned that this SSI brings in 2 elements, and I think this is something that's happened before with the SSI, where we had the Scottish the beef suckler scheme and good environmental status conflated because it was about compliance. But I do think this is an issue that I would appreciate the Cabinet Secretary recognises this. We as a committee are aware that we're going to be looking at a lot of SSIs, and when two things get put together, where one bit we would like to actually maybe do something different from another bit, it makes it very difficult for us to do our work. So I just want to put that out there, that you could bear that in mind in the future as you bring forward SSIs and make it easier for us to actually address some of the issues that we really need to be addressing.
Elena.
Thanks, Convener, and thank you to Jackie Bailey for coming to the committee to represent her constituents. And having myself witnessed electrofishing counting take place in the river right in front of my house that my father has worked on with the River Irvine Improvement Association, I understand the views of local people who do that work. I also understand acutely that we have a responsibility as well to the iconic species that is our wild salmon. So whilst I understand and appreciate the issues surrounding data, what is the correct data and how we actually deploy that correct data, and I would urge that there would be close working between associations, trusts and the government to ensure that we have that correct information. I feel as if at this point in time I couldn't support a motion to annul, simply because I would be concerned that we would be removing protections for salmon stocks within our rivers. But I do take on board everything that everyone has said and hope that we can get to a position in the near future where this isn't having to be a perennial issue about coming to the committee. Because I would have concerns as well that I think associations up and down the country would take issue with some of the data at some point, and we could end up in a situation where we would be doing this all the time with different associations making representations every year. Thank you.
Tim Eagle.
Thank you. Can I just... I think this, Cabinet Secretary, this is the slight problem that I've got, is that actually I agree with Lena Whittam's point that actually there's a danger here, isn't there, if we annul. But then I'm also with Rhoda saying, actually, I don't like to be put in this position where I feel that things are being compromised, that we're not getting... And that worries me. Like, I'm hearing that effectively the people on the ground are saying they have submitted data, and then Marine Scotland are saying we haven't received that data. And that feels odd. You know, what's going on in there? So I go back to that thing I said earlier on about what is the promise. If I don't vote to annul this today, because actually I am worried about the fact that we're not, I think you're probably right, Cabinet Secretary, you probably haven't got the time frame to get this back. What is the guarantee to me that we're not going to be in this same situation next year?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. And again, thank you for the points raised. I mean, obviously there are a number of issues bound up in this, and I think what we've talked about, particularly around the data, working off the best evidence that we have, and naturally, as Dr Minimus outlined as well, some of that just takes more time to build up and develop, and it's not necessarily a resource thing that we can easily put in place to try and fix. It requires time and constant improvements to the methodology and how we assess that. I think we've got to look at this in the bigger picture and the round in terms of the wider context of work that we've talked about as well today, the wild salmon strategy, the implementation plan. And again, I've already said that I'm happy to write to the committee and provide more information on that so you can see...
Cabinet Secretary, sorry, I'm just very conscious that I don't think you're addressing Mr Eagle's point, and that is, how do we stop the issue where the committee is faced with making a decision where 99% of the regulations we agree with, but there is one part of the regulation affecting one area which we are not comfortable with because of the evidence we've heard from constituents. I think his question was, how do we address that in the future? Not the more broad general approach, but how do we address those anomalies?
Well, it's through, obviously, some of these issues are only picked up through the scrutiny of the instruments. And again, this is one fishery. There are a number of river systems that are covered by this regulation. So, of course, in terms of bringing those together in the round, it makes sense for us to do that. Now, again, we could be in a position where another fishery can test the data that we've brought forward. But as I've already outlined, we do try and address these issues at an early stage where that arises. And that's already resulted in 2 river systems, their grading being changed because of that information and the work that we do. Now, can we categorically say that every river system will be happy with the assessment that we receive? Of course not. So, you know, there's no saying we could well end up in a position again. But that's where I think the work that we do on the data, the work of the peer review that's being undertaken on the methodology is all important. But I am confident as much as I can be, and from what Dr Middlemas has outlined to the committee today, the methodology stands up to that international scrutiny and how this is carried out elsewhere, and I think that's really important to bear in mind. And we have to do what we can, as members have made that point around the committee today, to protect this iconic species for Scotland, and that's exactly what these regulations set out to do, which is why it's vital that they are approved by the Parliament.
Rhoda Grant.
To put on the record, it's not one river, one fishery. The government themselves admit 46% of respondents to the SSI had concerns over the data. I think people have maybe given up trying to get improvements because this has been ongoing, but nearly half of the respondents had concerns.
Cabinet Secretary.
Again, we listened to those concerns and we've shown that we've responded to, can we solve all problems that rivers have identified? Potentially not. But again, as we've already highlighted, we have changed those assessments where we've had that information or where the methodology or the data we've received has been queried. So it shows that we do listen and we do respond to that.
Thank you. My question, and I feel the committee is going to find this quite difficult. Can I just get on record, Cabinet Secretary? We've heard at length from Jackie Baillie and the evidence she's provided, some of that evidence via FOIs. Do you dispute Jackie Baillie's contribution and the evidence she's given today, or maybe disputes a bit hard? Do you recognise the issue that Jackie Baillie's constituents have had? So that's the first question. The second question is that I think the understanding is that these regulations really need to come into force on the 24th of February to make sure that we don't have the unintended consequences if we annul this, that rivers like the River Annan are put at detriment. If the committee was minded to annul this, would there be practically the time for the Cabinet Secretary and our officials to go away and revisit the issues that Jackie Baillie has brought up to amend the instrument for the committee to consider in time for it to be actioned by the 24th of February?
I think on your second point there's no way I could commit to that without getting the legal advice or see what resource or what would be required to do that. But again, what would be the basis? And if this instrument was annulled, would the basis of the information that I receive and the advice I receive from officials change? I don't believe it would. So again, we could just be in a similar position. But I would be concerned about the timescales, which are increasingly tight, and I would be concerned that we wouldn't be able to do that in time. And sorry, Convener, can you remind me of your first point? Sorry, it was about Jackie Baillie and the concerns of her constituents. Now, Jackie Baillie has written to me on behalf of the Loch Lomond Angling Improvement Association. I take that correspondence seriously. Of course I do. I take all correspondence I receive seriously and consider the points that are raised within that before issuing responses to it. And I know that officials have also engaged directly with the association. So I would like to think that that shows that we are engaging and we are listening.
Thank you. Any other? Yep, Tim.
So just on that point, Cabinet Secretary, then, because again, I go back to the convener's point about just the time frame to try and get this changed. So Jackie Baillie has written to you. So is there the option of further engagement post this regulation over the summer perhaps, or in spring or whenever, with all these bodies, the ones that Rhoda Grant is mentioning that have responded to this, and with Jackie Baillie's constituents, to ensure that this time next year we are absolutely all on the same page about data, how that data is coming into Marine Scotland, making sure nothing gets lost, etc. Would you commit to making sure that engagement happens over the next year?
There is that engagement. I mean, as I've already outlined, officials have engaged with Angling Association and they do engage with fisheries boards and trusts in relation to that. And again, I just want to highlight, we've taken direct action as a response to some of that information that we received. But I think I just want to be concerned that, or just to make the point that, I mean, even looking at these regulations, would it change the basis of the information that or the advice that I receive? We still have to work on the available methodology that we have and the data and information that we get. Now, that could improve in coming years, or if we get the further information from fisheries boards and trusts that we don't already receive that helps provide that more complete picture. Would it radically change where we are at this precise moment in time? Potentially not. So, of course, we would undertake that engagement. So we want to give that assurance because we have these discussions anyway, and that's very much part and parcel of the work that takes place. And I'm sure the officials would agree with that.
Okay.
I suppose I've got one. I think I've got one final question before asking Jackie Bailey to come back in. Is the potential, given the concern that committee has, and I must admit, I feel like I'm almost being held to ransom, where we have to make a decision, and this is not the first time we've had SSIs where the committee's been in this position, where we need to do something, or there's a cliff edge, or it's going to be a disaster, whilst we still have concerns about some of the parts of the SSI. Is there the potential, or would there be any desire for the Cabinet Secretary to continue to look at the evidence provided by the constituents that Jackie Bailey is representing today and potentially bring forward an amendment to this SSI in the situation where the data did suggest a different grading than currently is the case, and the committee can consider that at a later stage without actually causing any adverse implications to the likes of the River Annan and other rivers. Is that a possibility?
Again, we have sought further information, so I can't at this stage say categorically or commit to bringing forward an amendment to the instrument because that hasn't been received. We haven't had those discussions, so I can't commit to that at this stage, unfortunately. And I know we're all bound by the timescales of the scrutiny of statutory instruments, and in this case, a negative instrument as well. But again, I can't categorically say I'm going to bring forward an amendment to the instrument because it depends on if further information was received, what that would have to consider, and I would have to seek further advice on that.
Okay, and certainly as a committee, I think it would be helpful if we have a more detailed explanation on how the Marine Director will actually address some of the issues that we've heard today prior to us inevitably considering a very similar SSI this time next year. That would be helpful. Is there any other members, any further comments? Can I ask Jackie Bailey to wind up, please?
Thank you very much, Convener. Who knew that salmon protection and conservation could be so interesting? But it has been a great debate. Can I say, you know, as a matter of record, I am always happy to engage with the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform in the islands at any point. But I think it is fair to say that my constituents have been engaging since 2016 and feel as if nothing has really changed. And it is Groundhog Day coming back talking about the same thing. Can I also, for the record, say it is not the methodology, and I entirely accept what the Cabinet Secretary has said about it being benchmarked against others. The reality is it's the data that is input. That is the issue before us. And we've been trying over more than 8 years now to get some sense in terms of the data into the methodology. Now, let me talk a little bit about the legislative process, because I'm always very much of the view that where there is a will, there is always a way. This Parliament has introduced regulations from scratch in days, and I would point you towards the cremation and burial regulation, something that affected my constituents directly. We've passed primary legislation, stages 1, 2 and 3, in a day in this Parliament, and it's been less than a week in its actual evolution. You could, taking the convener's lead, amend this subordinate legislation. Indeed, you could resubmit it, removing the contentious provisions and leaving Annan and others in tomorrow. Right? It is that easy to do. And therefore, I would invite the committee to consider carefully what option they wish to encourage the government to follow. I can't, and neither would Loch Lomond, want to speak for what's going on in other rivers, but I go back to a point that Rhoda Grant made. 46% of those consulted raised issues about the data. We can't keep going on like this, year after year, having the same conversations because the data has not improved. We're not doing salmon conservation or regeneration, for that matter, any good if we continue to lack the evidence to act. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Ms Bailey. Can I ask whether you wish to press or withdraw the motion?
I intend to press. No.
Thank you. So the question is that motion S6M 16130 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a vote. Those who support the motion in the name of Jackie Bailey, please raise your hand now. Those who do not support the motion? Those who wish to abstain? And the result of the vote is 1 for, 7 against. The motion to annul is therefore not agreed. Finally, is the committee content to delegate authority to me to sign off a report on our deliberations of this negative instrument? Thank you. That completes consideration of the negative instrument. I'm now going to suspend the meeting until 10:40 to allow changeover of witnesses. So our next item of business is to take evidence from the Scottish Government on its budget for 2025 to 2026. And I welcome back Mary Goujon, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands, and our supporting officers. Today we have George Burgess, the Director of Agriculture and Rural Economy, Helen Carter, the Joint Head of Finance from Agriculture and Rural Economy Directorate, and Ian Wallace, Director of Marine Scotland, Director of the Marine from the Scottish Government. We have the Cabinet Secretary attending remotely. However, we're disappointed that we don't have the officials actually in the room here today. Given how long this appointment has been in the diary, it's disappointing that, as I say, the supporting officials are remote, particularly given the importance of this agenda item. But just to remind everybody, we're approximately 2 hours for this session, and can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a brief opening statement?
Thank you very much, Convener. When I attended the pre-budget session in September, I set out my priorities at that time for my portfolio, and I'm pleased to come back today to outline how the 2025-26 Scottish Budget, which was presented to Parliament in December, will help to deliver on those priorities within the wider context of the Government's priorities. I believe that this is a budget for delivery. It directly addresses the issues people are concerned about. It's a budget for hope and builds on the positive change that we've delivered for Scotland, helping to create more jobs, putting more money in people's pockets. And the budget will protect and build on the substantial investment that the Government has already delivered for the people of Scotland. Of course, the budget focuses resource across the 4 key priorities which are set out in the programme for Government of eradicating child poverty, growing the economy, tackling the climate emergency and ensuring high quality and sustainable public services. But of course, the budget is also set against continued and unprecedented challenges to public finances. The Government has been clear that the extent of challenges won't be addressed in a single year. The UK autumn budget was a step in the right direction, but while the additional funding received is welcome, of course the block grant position represents just a 1% increase in real terms for resource, while there's a 7% increase in real terms for capital. But there does remain a projected and growing gap between forecast funding and planned spending. But despite that challenge, this budget will invest over £1 billion in 2025 and 26 in the Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands portfolio. It will continue to provide Scotland's farmers, crofters and land managers with the most generous package of direct support in the UK, investing over £660 million in support to agriculture. And when the UK Government removed its ring-fence support for agriculture, we've continued to apply that to the funding received in the block grant. This budget returns £20 million to the Railway budget as additional funding to support transformation and reform in Scotland's farming and food production industry as pledged to the sector, and commits to returning the remaining deferred funding in 2026-27. Over £150 million in funding is committed to ensure our land and forests will help to tackle climate change, protect nature and support green jobs, skills and businesses. We also want to support our island communities to be resilient and successful. Over £9 million will go directly to where it's most needed to help us meet the ambitions outlined in our National Islands Plan. And we'll continue to target our marine budget towards the responsibilities for the integrated management of Scotland's seas. My priorities in this area are clear. The budgets allocated to my portfolio will continue to make a vital difference to our rural, coastal and islands economy. And I look forward to discussing some of these issues with the committee today. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'm going to kick off with questions. You suggested the budget was a lot of things, but what you didn't suggest was this was a budget of disappointment. As Cabinet Secretary, you failed to, like every other sector, to increase the budget. And despite that 1% increase in revenue and 7% increase in capital, what we see is over a 3% decrease in your portfolio. So, disappointment is probably an underestimate of what those in forestry, marine and agriculture actually think. As part of our report into the Agriculture and Rural Communities Bill, we called on the Government to ensure that there was multi-year ring-fence funding. But now that we see that that ring-fenced element has been removed from the UK block grant, can you set out exactly how the Scottish Government is going to provide certainty to farmers and crofters going forward?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I think, first of all, I just want to address the comments that you made initially, Convener. And I think if you're basing that on, I think, some of the information that had been provided by SPICE in the budget, I mean, that's where I would disagree with the figures as they've been presented there, because what that doesn't take account of when you're comparing to other portfolios is the in-year transfers and changes to the portfolio budget, where we switched from resource funding to capital. It doesn't take our capital funding into consideration either, and it also doesn't take into consideration the climate package funding of £150 million, of which some of that will be funded directly to this portfolio. Because I think it's really important to highlight that when you do take that into account, yes, the resource has overall decreased by 2.6% in real terms, but when you combine that with the increase in capital, which saw a 19.7% real terms increase, that means that we've had a 0.3% real terms increase in budget on last year, which equates to a 2.7% increase in cash terms as well. So I think it's really important to clarify that first and foremost. And there's no doubt there have still been really difficult choices that have had to be made right across government. When you mentioned the agriculture budget, in particular the request for multi-year settlements. Now, we were seriously concerned, obviously, with the decisions that were taken by the UK government, the removal of the ring fencing, the barnetising of the funding that comes to Scotland as well, which takes no account of our overall land size, where we previously received around 17% of the budget. So we were seriously concerned about what that means. Now, I know and appreciate that there are calls for multi-year funding. Government would very much like to have that multi-year certainty and that clarity, but we haven't been given that. We've still just been given an annual settlement. But of course, there is going to be the budget review coming up. And if that is able to provide more multi-year certainty, then of course, as soon as we're in a position and we're able to provide that, that's what I would look to do as well. And as I highlighted in my comments too, and as the First Minister has said in his own statements as well, and the ring fencing of funding, that funding has been passed on in full from the UK government to the funding has been passed on in full that came from the UK government to agriculture, and we have, of course, added additional funding to that as well. And just to highlight, it was the 620.7 million that was baselined into the budget for the coming year.
Thank you. I'm still concerned about you continue to talk about ring-fence funding. What we see now is the responsibility for budget allocation being totally the responsibility of the Scottish Government, and no longer can the Scottish Government say that their rural funding is dependent on that ring-fence money coming from Westminster. And we have seen a record increase in block grant, and I think only once since devolution have we actually seen the block grant decrease in real terms. So there's still the question, given that we'll have a rural support plan that's over multi-years, surely the only way that you can expect anybody to have any confidence in that rural support fund plan is to have multi-year funding.
Again, though, it would be completely irresponsible of me to commit to funding that I don't yet have. Now, as I've said, we do hope to be in a position, or the UK government is expected to outline, I think, potentially what funding could look like over a 3-year period, which, of course, a multi-year settlement we would very much welcome. But I think it would be irresponsible of me to commit to a multi-year funding package when I don't yet have that assurance of the monies I'll be receiving from the UK government.
Thank you. Tim Eagle.
Question on that before I do mine.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for that. Just on that multi-year funding, I think because I've spoken to a number of bodies about this, it was a massive ask, not least from the NFUS, the National Youth Farmers Union of Scotland. But you can put a caveat in, can't you? So, because you're absolutely right in the rural support plan, if you're going to have this 5 or 7 years, whatever it will be, ask of the agricultural industry, then that needs to be, we need to be protected as we move forward in that. So, is there a reason why you couldn't say, we as the Scottish Government will promise to deliver this funding for 5 years with the caveat that we get that money from the United Kingdom Government?
I mean, I absolutely appreciate that call from stakeholders, and from the engagement I undertake, that's something that I hear regularly too. Again, it would be irresponsible of me, I believe, to say that we are committing to multi-year funding. I completely appreciate the point that you're making around caveats of that, but of course, I hope that's also what I'm trying to set out, and what I'm able to, and what I'm trying to make clear as well. And I said, you know, through the passage of the Agriculture and Rural Communities Bill, that if we were in a position to offer that, then of course we would. It not only helps for the government planning, but it's the wider benefit that it means for the industry, for our producers and our stakeholders more widely across the portfolio, knowing that they can plan ahead for those funds. But again, until we have that assurance, and I know what funding is going to be received from the UK government, I'm not in a position to do that. But I hope that that position will change.
Okay, thank you for that. And can I ask as well, around, obviously, the convener's initial statement was talking about a cut to the budget, the rural portfolio, and very much, according to the graph we've got on page 4, it does look like there's a very clear cut to the rural portfolio. You laid out a few things there that says, well, actually, it's not a cut if you do this. Have you, has there been a letter to the committee, or have you set that out in writing? Because I couldn't write everything you were saying down. And if you haven't, would you...
I'd be happy to... sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but just to say I'd be happy to follow that up and set that out in writing in terms of the figures that I outlined to the convener.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And the other point I was just going to mention on sort of the wider context of funding in terms of Tier 1 and Tier 2, I was looking back, I mean, that really hasn't changed very much in sort of 8-9 years. So, you know, if you look at inflation over that time, that sort of 620 or 680 million, I think 682 million it is this year, should probably be about 50 to 70 million higher if you look at inflation. I mean, that's what farmers have faced on the ground. So I do think there's a future discussion perhaps around how that sort of what will be Tier 1, Tier 2 will increase. And if you wanted to touch on that, that would be great. But the main question I probably should get to is, John Swinney obviously made an ironclad commitment to return the 46 million. We've got that kind of commitment, although we got it over 2 years. We kind of thought it would be 1. But I guess the question now is, since the budget has been announced, what has the department done to take that forward? And what does that Agricultural Transformation Fund look like?
Right, I just want to make sure I cover all the points that you've raised there. So importantly, I think on that point that you've mentioned and the overall funding that's available, and I suppose what would equate to the Pillar 1 support that we provide by means of direct payments, you're absolutely right. In terms of the budget that's there, I think if you were to, you know, we've been at that figure for a number of years now, the £620 million baseline that was used and that we received from the UK government. And I think when you consider, I think, what that would be worth, and I think it's a 10.4% decrease on what payments should be at, which would bring it to around, I think, just under 700 million. That should be the level that's there. Now, I think it does bring me on to, I think, the one outstanding recommendation from the Bew Review, which was for the UK government and the devolved administrations to engage in a conversation to discuss intra-UK allocations of that spend. Now, we had written previously to the previous UK government, to the current UK government, asking that discussion takes place, because it's still a discussion that we need to have to ensure that we get our fair share of funding. But as yet, we haven't had a response to calls for that. But I think it's really important and vital that we have that discussion about what fair funding looks like, because I do think when you consider the landmass that we have in Scotland, what we're able to do for food production, for climate and for nature, I think we are entitled to a wider share of any land-based funding that there is in the UK. And sorry, could you just remind me of your second point?
It was just on the Agricultural Transformation Fund. So obviously, I think 2 points. One point is, you know, it would be nice to understand why it was that you've decided to give that over 2 years rather than 1, just that 46 million and 1. And then obviously you've put that very much into that Agricultural Transformation Fund. So, you know, why is that? And then has any work been done? What does that look like or moving forward?
Yes, thank you. And sorry, I hadn't responded to that first time round. So you're absolutely right in terms of the Agricultural Transformation Fund. And I think what was key with that is, obviously there's been a number of asks from industry as to what that funding could be utilised for. We felt it was really important. We had those discussions with industry to see how that funding could best be allocated and utilised. We also think it's important that that money is additional. We know that our greatest requirement has been for capital funding as well, which is why that's capital funding. But I think it's also important that, yes, it could have all come back in 1 year, but what's important is that we're actually able to spend and utilise this funding. So the lion's share of that would be returned next year, which I think is a positive thing, because it enables us to, first of all, ensure that we will be able to fully utilise the funding within year, but knowing that there is going to be a return of that funding next year as well, depending on what schemes we're looking at. So, I mean, there had been some suggestions, and I think some areas that I'm quite keen that we look at and work that we're undertaking at pace and that we've heard from our stakeholders is, obviously there's concern that we haven't had a food processing marketing cooperation grant for a number of years now because of the significant constraints we've had on our capital budget. So, you know, are there options around that? What can we do for the next generation, for new entrants to farming as well? Is there capital support that we could provide that could be helpful there? So I'm afraid I don't have at the moment, you know, the cast iron programmes or the plans for how that funding will be spent, but I'd be more than happy to keep the committee informed when we know how the Agricultural Transformation Fund as a whole is intended to be utilised.
And can I ask one more question quickly? Just on that, do you have a timeline for that? When do you hope that this scheme, obviously there is still clearly a bit of work to go, but when would you hope that this scheme would sort of kick off?
Well, ideally we want to have the plans in place for that as soon as possible, because we want to have the funds up and running so that people can apply early in the financial year. If there were schemes where people needed, say, planning permission, we appreciate all of that takes time. So, of course, the earlier we're able to say what are part of these schemes and what form part of them, then the earlier people can apply and we can, again, ensure that we're utilising that money. So, again, we are working at pace to see, first of all, what the biggest requirement is, but also to see what's deliverable within that time frame as well. So, again, I'm more than happy to keep the committee up to date in that, because I appreciate the interest that there will be in these capital funds. But yes, more than happy to keep you informed.
Thank you. And just, I suppose, just a very quick point. I mean, obviously, the money we're talking about was the fair share we got from the last few review discussions. So, very supportive, actually. I would be very supportive of any discussion with the United Kingdom government over a fair share for Scotland. But I do hope the Scottish government will make sure that does stay in the farming portfolio.
Yes.
Thank you. I believe George Burgess has indicated he wishes to come in.
Thank you, Convener. To respond to Mr Eagle's initial question of what work is being done, there is actually a meeting going on right now as we speak amongst my officials as to frame advice to the Cabinet Secretary on this. We need to look at, as the Cabinet Secretary has outlined, a number of different areas that might well be deserving of additional funding. We need to look at the mechanisms, whether we use some of our existing grant mechanisms or create new ones, how we deliver support for the food processing sector as well. So, to give assurance that there is a lot of work that is going on exactly this question, so that we can get decisions and indication to the sector just as soon as we possibly can. I would also say that on the split of funding between the next financial year and the year after, and without wanting to put words into their mouth, the reaction that we've had from NFUS has actually been positive about the larger sum of money being available in the second year, not least to help businesses to plan. The budget document gives the certainty that money is coming back, so it helps businesses to plan for that. Thank you.
I promise, Convener. Just one very, very small one. Just thank you, Mr Burgess, for that. Just on that, I guess when we do these schemes, one of the slight concerns, and one of the things we're actually talking about quite a lot in Europe at the moment, is bureaucracy and red tape and just the depth of the application process. So I suppose it's a shout out, but if you would consider making sure that when this application does come up, that it's not a very, very complicated application process that might cost new entrants thousands of pounds with consultants to actually access the grant.
Yeah, I see George nodding, and I think I'm nodding as well, because I think we're very cognisant of that. We don't want to make it too onerous for people to apply to, let alone for us to administer. Yes. So completely appreciate your point.
Sorry, thank you.
Thank you. Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. I'd like to ask about the 75% funding cut in the National Test Programme, and this is in the year that Government wants to introduce part of the whole farm plan. So I wonder if you could give a bit of an explanation about that and how the emphasis on increasing uptake at the time when there's a budgetary cut.
Yes, I'm happy to. So I think just to break down within that, in the funding that's overall available within the agricultural reform programme. So we're maintaining. I think the delivery costs of the agricultural reform programme are staying at the same level, which is £5 million. But the national test programme, well, importantly, now we have capital available over the course of this year, contributing to that too. But I think when we have had higher amounts allocated to the national test programme, we haven't been able to fully utilise that funding. And I think we've talked in previous committees about the level of claims that we've seen come through from the Preparing for Sustainable Farming. And that's why we do have an amount allocated towards that we believe we will fully utilise with the claims that are coming through this year, because I do think it's important in a year where we are making some of those requirements or are going to be making some of the requirements for the whole farm plan mandatory, such as carbon audits and the soil sampling analysis, animal health and welfare plans, that we continue to provide support for that as well. So it's really just a greater reflection of the level of spend that we've been able to undertake over the course of the past few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that funding is available to, when you've got 2 or 3 different plans to put in place and the costs that are involved in that, and actually echoing Tim Eagle's point about the plans that cost money.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I think it was obviously really disappointing in the first year, because I think when I first appeared at committee or at one of the budget appearances, I think that we had seen a really low level of claims initially, which I do understand it's a new scheme and it's very much demand-led. But I think over the course of the past few years, we have seen that gradually increase as more people have come aware, and obviously as we're approaching the point where some of those are becoming mandatory. So I completely agree with your point. I think that the fact that we're able to continue to provide that support will be really important. So we do have funding allocated for that this year, but I think it has been positive that we've seen that trajectory. And I think the number of claims we're sitting at this year is not as high as what we've seen last year so far, but of course we still have a couple of months of that to go, and it's always that last period in the claims window where we do see a large uptick in people processing their claims.
Thank you.
Just in the back of that, so you talked about preparing for sustainable farming, which has a carbon audit element to it, and also we have a carbon audit funding through the Farm Advisory Service. And it's my understanding that the PSF wasn't fully committed last time round. Can you give us clarification whether that scheme is likely to reopen, and if so, when? And also, the Farm Advisory Service was paused in September 2024. Can you tell us whether that is likely to reopen or whether it's permanently closed?
Yes, so on that, this was due to be, 24-25 was due to be the last year that we were offering support for carbon audits and for soil sampling, but I am keen that that continues in the coming year, as I say, that given some of these audits are going to become mandatory. So I would be looking to confirm further details of that in due course. I'm not in a position to say exactly when that would reopen or relaunch, but again, that's what we're considering for the coming year. And you're right in relation to the Farm Advisory Service and the carbon audits that they were offering, but we did also have that avenue available through the Preparing for Sustainable Farming, where I believe people were being redirected to. In terms of the ability to offer that over the coming year, I'm afraid I don't know if George would have more information on what exactly would be available through FAS next year. I expect that it has been part of the offering that they've had in previous financial years. I would expect that to be the case this time round, but I don't know if George has any further information.
I think we're expecting a similar level of funding to be available for FAS. And as the Cabinet Secretary says, the fact that the particular carbon audit stream from FAS did have to close in September, as has happened in previous years, has not meant that farmers have been unable to get support. It's just that support has instead been delivered through Preparing for Sustainable Farming. PSF closed at the end of December. In the way that it normally does, but as the Cabinet Secretary says, farmers still have until late February to come in with the claims for that. And as the Cabinet Secretary says, the intention is to reopen PSF so that businesses can claim again. Over the last couple of years, what we've seen is a sort of hockey stick, that there are relatively low claims in the early part of the year and a big peak towards the end.
Certainly, there'll be a big peak if the farmers feel it's going to close at the end of February, not reopen. So, just for clarification, it's likely the PSF fund will reopen, but we're still waiting for clarification of when that's going to happen. But carbon audit funding will not be available through FAS. Is that correct?
It's not available at the moment, but as George was outlining, I think we're actually providing FAS with a slight increase in funding over the course of the coming financial year. So I would expect that would still be the offering. But again, it is my intention to run Preparing for Sustainable Farming over the course of the coming year, but I'll update the committee when I have more details on that.
Okay, thank you. Ariane, you indicated you wish to come in. Is it on these funding schemes? Thank you, Ariane. Yep. And then I'll move to Emma Harper.
Thanks very much, Convener. And very briefly, I just wanted to ask around the National Test Programme and the soil sampling part of it, Cabinet Secretary. What I'm aware of, and it's good to hear that there's more uptake, but what I'm aware of is that not everyone is sampling their soil. I've become aware that maybe what we need is a pathway where people are beginning, but there are other people that are much more deep into soil sampling, and I just wondered what kind of support there will be for that. And in particular, as you know, we amended the Agriculture and Rural Communities Act to recognise soil biology as something that we need to be supporting farmers to be looking at. So I just wonder if that's going to come into the national test programmes, or is that going to be part of the direction of travel within the whole farm plans?
Thank you very much for raising that, because you do raise some really important points there. And as you say, and I think during the passage of the bill, we talked about the importance, and I think some of the amendments recognised, of soil health and soil biology as part of that too. Now, in terms of the Preparing for Sustainable Farming, there aren't any plans at the moment to extend what's available through that. We are focusing on the core audits that are currently available, and I'm not expecting that to change dramatically if we're continuing that scheme over the course of the coming year. But I think the ongoing work and support is really important, and I think we've touched on that in some of the discussions we've had before. So it's all very well undertaking the analysis, and when it comes to carbon audits, to undertaking those, but of course it's the work that's undertaken afterwards that is really important, and the advice that's available. So again, we're not directly supporting that through the funding schemes that we have available, but I think as we're looking to implement the future tiers of the support framework as well, that continuous learning and development that we talked about through the passage of the Agriculture and Rural Communities Bill Act, as it now is, I think all of that will feature heavily and will be really important.
Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Hello again, Cabinet Secretary. Just before I ask my question, I've got a question about agri-environment schemes, but it just occurs to me that, we were briefly talking about multi-annual funding, and if the UK Government committed to multi-annual funding, which is what we had before our unfortunate exit from the EU, if the UK Government committed to multi-annual funding, would that make it easier for you to commit to multi-annual funding?
Absolutely, yes, it would, because I think we'd have that security that we know what we're going to receive and when, and it would then enable us to do that. So I think if we get that multi-annual commitment, then we're in a better position to look at that.
Okay, all right, thanks for clarifying that. Okay, so I've got a question about the agri-environment schemes. I'm interested in exploring budget lines around that. And I think I'm correct when I say that the government wants to support active farming and provide support for sustainable food production and promoting food security. So I would be interested if you could tell me about the budget allocation plans to support farmers and crofters and land managers in terms of agri-environment schemes, because I know there is a lot of different schemes out there, and you've just talked about soil sampling, for example. So I'd be interested in hearing about the budget for that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think sometimes the budget, in terms of how it's set out, doesn't necessarily help, because it doesn't always cover, I think, the full extent of the schemes, or they'll be under a more general heading when we have a number of different schemes within them. So I think when you look at, obviously, the biggest element of funding that we have is what we pay through the basic payment scheme and greening, which of course now have their own conditions attached through voluntary coupled support as well. But I think one of the key schemes that we have that you've quite rightly mentioned is the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme. And I think in terms of helping us achieve what we're trying to do with food production, but and working with the land in a way that also works for climate and nature, it's probably one of the key schemes, if not the key scheme, that enables us to do that. So I think an important thing to point out in relation to the funding for that, I think the way it's presented in the budget, it looks like there's a fairly small capital element allocated to the AIC scheme this year. However, I think I touched on in one of my earlier responses, there is a climate change fund available, of which some of that has been allocated to AIC. So the full AIC funding isn't listed in the RALRI budget. That falls within the net zero budget line, but we're due to receive an extra 4.15 million, I think, in capital to help support the AIC scheme for the coming year, and that would enable us to fund all the eligible applications that we received for the round last year, as well as AIC is one of these schemes that runs on 5-year contracts, as well as funding all the previous contracts that we've had as well. But again, it's by no means the only scheme that we have in relation to that. It was also supported. We used the Agricultural Transformation Fund last year to support AICs. That was helping with really trying to help businesses on the way to adhering to the water environment regulations that are coming into force at the start of next year. So looking at slurry storage, irrigation lagoons, and a couple of years ago it was looking at slurry spreading equipment as well. Within the business development line of the budget too, we have a number of different schemes in there, knowledge transfer and innovation fund, as well as a host of others that people can apply to. I think funds like that are really important in supporting and encouraging innovation in farming and crofting that we want to see as well. But again, I do think the key fund that we have in terms of achieving all the outcomes that we want to see is probably the AIC scheme, but I did feel it was important to point that out. And actually, another thing that I've neglected to mention as well so far is funding that we also provide to Nature Scot, who are helping us pilot different approaches. And over the course of the past year, we've helped support their Farming with Nature programme, and that's been piloting the biodiversity audit in the app that's being considered there. It's also been looking at piloting an outcomes-based approach for farming as well. So we've provided funding to enable them to undertake that work for us as well, which I think has been proved really vital. And especially when we're looking at biodiversity auditing, I think having these tools available is really important.
Just a final wee quick question. You've described lots of different schemes, and I'm assuming that some schemes may end and then others may come on board because of innovation and just farming practices that are wide-ranging in terms of beef, sheep, dairy, for instance, and arable. So is there a schematic that we could see in terms of what is out there so that it would help us understand the diversity of all the different schemes that are available?
Yes, I'd be happy to set that out for committee and show what is going to be available. Because on top of that, and just as you were speaking there, that reminded me, there's also funding that we provide for the Dairy Growth Board as an example too. So I think it's, there are a number of different funding streams that we have to help industry, both directly and indirectly. So I'd be happy to set that out for committee and to provide that transparency.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Convener.
Tim Eagle.
A very quick practical point, Cabinet Secretary, just to confirm within the EEC scheme, obviously one of the slight barriers that I've heard of in the past to accessing the scheme is capital costs for things like fencing. So if you want to manage an area of ground for way to graze grassland or whatever it would be, but actually at the moment it's one big field, can I just check that in this year's application process there is the ability to access capital works if needed?
Well, we haven't actually opened the round for the coming year as yet, and that's what we're considering at the moment. So, of course, over the course of the past couple of years, we've had to have more restricted rounds because of the capital situation that we faced. So this is all part of what we're considering at the moment. But again, I'd be happy to take that point away and consider that for future iterations of AICS.
Just before we move away from agricultural funding, I want to go back to a comment you made in response to Emma Harper. So you're looking for multi-year funding commitment from the UK government, but that by its very nature would suggest that there would be a ring-fenced allocation of that funding for the rural portfolio. On that basis, how would that ring-fence money be calculated? Would it be on the basis of a percentage of the spend that there was in agriculture and rural affairs south of the border, and therefore in some way connected to rural policy south of the border? How would you actually negotiate what that ring-fenced settlement might look like?
I mean, because that has essentially been Barnetized now, we are going to be tied to that. But I'll hand over to George. He'll be able to provide more detail on that.
I think, actually, if we go back to the original BEW review, the recommendation was for all the administrations to sit down around the table and discuss exactly that question. As the Cabinet Secretary has said, that was a recommendation agreed by the previous UK government, although not acted on, and the current UK government has instead decided to move to Barnet. Were future funding to be based on a percentage of that south of the border, that would probably be a better position than we will end up with under Barnet. But the real answer is that we actually need to get round the table with UK government. Various stakeholders, including NFUS, have made the case that Scotland, with its larger landmass and greater potential to make improvements on biodiversity and climate change, is perhaps deserving of a greater share of the funding. But at the moment, it's, I'm afraid, not looking likely that we will be able to have that discussion with the UK government. So we may be stuck with Barnet. What I was wanting to come in and was provide a little bit of further clarity on AICS. While generally our budgets are single year, AICS is one of the areas where we do provide multi-year commitments. So actually the budget for the 25-26 financial year is actually to deliver on AICS commitments that have been entered into over the last couple of years. We have the AICS 2024 round, so the applications have come in, have been assessed, and the budget, we are clear, is sufficient to meet the applicants there that are deserving of funding.
Okay, thanks for that. We'll now move on to our second theme on forestry, and a question from Elena Whittam.
Thanks, Convener. The committee took evidence last week from forestry stakeholders, and they collectively expressed a need for stable funding to provide confidence and investment for the sector to be able to meet its targets. One stakeholder actually likened this to a supertanker, not easily stopped, turned around or restarted. And given the reduction in funding available last year due to the budgetary constraints and pressures, there is an expectation from stakeholders that the planting targets for this year will be missed. In light of this, Cabinet Secretary, it would be helpful for the committee to understand why woodland grants have not yet been restored to 2023-24 levels within the draft budget, and how you envisage target realisation within this allocation.
I think the characterisation that you've expressed there is absolutely right, and I think that, I mean, as I've said to committee previously, you know, we were absolutely not where we would have hoped to be in relation to woodland grants and support for forestry creation in Scotland, because there were significant cuts to that budget over the course of last year. Now, I think it has been really positive to see the increases in the budget that we do have allocated to forestry. This year we've seen an increase of 18%. Now, it does mean that, you know, as you've outlined and as you've heard from different stakeholders and evidence, we're not going to meet the 18,000 hectares. You know, the peak of the planting that we saw over the course of last year was 15,000 hectares, which, you know, was such a positive trajectory that we had been on. So that's where it's really unfortunate that because of the budget cuts that we'd had last year, we weren't on track to meet the 18,000 hectare target, and we're still not going to be on track to do that this year. But I think just coming back to that characterisation that was made, that was like turning a tanker around, just as you know, it will take time for this to build back up. So again, even if there had been an even bigger increase in the woodland creation budget or the funding available for Scottish forestry, would all of that have been able to be utilised? I think we've got to match that to projects that we know can come through the pipeline, and hopefully continue that. Now that we've seen the increase here, we can continue on that positive trajectory going forward, and hopefully rebuild that confidence in the sector that they can continue to plan and invest.
I mean, the committee is very aware from stakeholders and probably from our own constituencies that forestry plays a hugely significant role in the rural economy. I would also argue in terms of supply chains for the companies that use that timber. So in my own constituency, I've got Egger, which is part of the wood panel industry, that brings really high quality jobs to a low productivity area. But there's concerns in 20 years' time that we might see the availability of timber start to drop off. And when we're looking to actually ensure we've got more homegrown timber so we can weather the issues in terms of the war in Ukraine, which interrupted supply, or indeed Brexit, which has also complicated issues. I have a concern round about the fact that Forestry and Land Scotland, who employ over 10,000 people across Scotland and who are one of our prominent timber producers, have had their capital budget reduced by 3.4 million. So at a time when we know that there's going to be increasing demand for timber across Scotland, why have they seen a budget cut this year?
I think there's a few different issues in relation to what you've mentioned there. So I think, firstly, in relation to the importance of forestry and the wider industry, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think from the fairly recent statistics that we published on that, it's worth over £1 billion to our economy, employs over 34,000 people. And I do think it always strikes me, I think the statistic that we're one of the UK is one of the biggest importers of timber, which just doesn't seem right. And I think there is so much more that we can and should try to do in relation to utilising our own homegrown resource, precisely because of all the challenges that you've mentioned there. So being able to have that continuity of supply and continuing to build the industry going forward is really important. So I think that's what I would touch on first of all, and absolutely recognise that. I would say that we obviously have two forestry agencies. We have Scottish Forestry and we have Forestry and Land Scotland. I would say that Scottish Forestry, they've had an increase in the budget of 18% that I was referring to, and that's where the majority of the funding for the woodland creation grants would come from. You're right in relation to Forestry and Land Scotland. There has been a 2% increase overall when you compare it to the budget from previous years. There are, of course, some transfers between the different in the way that the budget is communicated this year as opposed to previously, because we make in-year transfers, because Forestry and Land Scotland are obviously a key partner when it comes to peatland restoration and a number of other key pieces of work. But I think the important element to focus on is the increase in the woodland creation grants and the funding that's available for that, because that will enable us to plant more hectares of woodland going forward.
Thanks for that. Just a small wee point. I suppose it would be really, beneficial for the committee to understand the in-year transfers up front of. I know we can't really because they're in-year transfers, so that makes it difficult. But I think when we're looking at budget lines and we're thinking about the year ahead, that is always going to make it tricky for us when there is in-year transfers that we actually can't really account for at this stage. But thank you, and I'll pass back to convener.
Sorry, just to say, I'd be more than happy to provide more further information on that, because I mean it's the case right across the portfolio. I mean, when you see what we have allocated for peatland restoration as an example, we tend to transfer that to different agencies who are delivering that work on our behalf. But I'd be happy to provide more information on that.
Tim Eagle.
Yes, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. So, I mean, if I've got this right, we've got a 2032 target of planting 200,000 hectares. We're only about 25% complete in that. And last year, from the emails I've been getting, the industry took quite a big hit. And actually, that because it says in our papers, and I've heard this from the industry as well, some of these big companies are putting in hundreds of millions of pounds of investment. It's not cheap to put in these processing sites. It's not cheap, actually, to extract timber or even to grow it. And it's over a very long time period. So, I mean, I was shown a graph that says we're going up slightly over the next few years, and then it's going to drop off significantly. And that potentially has been made worse by those significant budget cuts last year. Do you think, Cabinet Secretary, in hindsight, you regret the fact that that money was taken out because of the lack of confidence it's now put into the industry?
Of course, to be honest, I have been really quite upfront and honest about the impact of that, and heard that, of course, really strongly from the engagement that I had myself with different parts of the industry, whether that's ENGOs from industry themselves and from different businesses. That came across loud and clear, and it was particularly disappointing. And as I've said previously to committee, when we were on such a positive trajectory, we planted 15,000 hectares, which is the highest ever level. To then, take that step back was bitterly disappointing. But we did have significant problems with capital funding right across government last year, which made those choices. I mean, every portfolio faced difficult choices, and that was particularly challenging that year. And I never want to be in a position where I'm bringing forward or having to make decisions like that and to make such significant cuts. That's where I do see, again, I've got to look ahead to the future. I think we have got to try and bring back that confidence and rebuild that confidence as well in the sector to ensure that we are maintaining and increasing that funding in the years ahead to enable us to reach the targets that we have. Because you are absolutely right, we're not going to, and I was open about that last year, we weren't going to meet the targets with the funding that we had available, and we were trying to work within the funding that we had to try and adjust that in ways that we would really try and maximise as much planting within that as possible, helping whether that's I think about half of the funding applications we received through the forestry grant scheme are from smaller farms and smaller businesses. Being able to continue that support is really important. So again, I want us to continue on that positive trajectory from here, so we can try and rebuild towards that target and not be in the position that we faced last year.
Burgess.
Good morning again. Is it still morning? Yes, it is. Good morning again, Cabinet Secretary. I just wanted to pick up on something that came up at our forestry roundtable. So we're talking about increasing planting and attempting to increase our timber grown in Scotland. But the thing that came up quite strongly for me was the challenge of getting people into the various jobs, the supply chain and at the kind of right in the forestry sector. And I just wondered where in this budget is there support for doing more of that, highlighting forestry as a job, for example, to young people and that kind of thing. Because if we want to meet those targets and those ambitions, and we want Scotland to become that forest nation where we're building housing from homegrown timber, as one example, we need people to be excited about taking up their roles in forestry and the respective supply chains.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and I think we recognise that as one area that needs focus and attention. I don't know if the committee will be aware of the UK task force that's been established to look at woodland creation, where the different administrations came together really to talk across the piece about the work that's taking place across the different administrations, where it makes sense for us to work together, or if there's areas of collaboration we can look at. But I think skills was one of those key areas, and I think you're absolutely right to focus on that as well. So as I say, and I think it's also important to recognise I'd had Woodland hosted a summit. I think it was either at the start of, I think it was over the course of last year, to really get, and that was a mix of stakeholders there from industry as well as from ENGOs to look at, well, what are the key challenges that we've got? How can we work together to try and tackle that? And it was really a really productive session, actually, with a lot of actions on the back of it. So there is work that's being undertaken in relation to that, to see how we can really encourage people to look at this as a career of choice going forward, because there's no doubt we are going to need the skills. But we do have a number of different working groups underway as well. We have the industry leadership group, which brings together another part of the sector too. So I would just want to offer that assurance that there is a lot of work underway to consider this. We also have the Chief Forester as well, who I'm going to be meeting in a couple of weeks' time to discuss the plans and the key areas of focus with her as well. So I do think that we are, hopefully, as I was saying in previous responses, we're on that positive trajectory going forward. Recognise there is work to do in all of these areas, whether that's woodland creation, on the timber and production side, but also importantly on skills. And we are taking action on each of these.
Cabinet Secretary, you say we're on a positive trajectory, but that's only because there was a huge and hugely damaging cut to the budget last year. Do you think that increasing the budget, but significantly less than industry is looking for, is positive? And does it not send the message to the industry that forestry is not a government's priority? We are still seeing funding that falls far short of what the industry needs. And in fact, we heard from Tim Eagle, there are some of our major industry players looking out with the United Kingdom to ensure they've got stability for their businesses. So is an increase in the budget this year, in the face of massive damaging cuts last year, actually adequate to turn this oil tank around, as Elena Whittam suggested?
I hope it will be, and as I say, I mean, that's where I hope I get us back onto that track, and as I say, get us back onto a positive trajectory. I mean, there's no shying away from the fact, and I haven't actually at all, and very much confronted the challenges that last year's budget presented, particularly in relation to forestry, and have completely heard what stakeholders have said to us about that. We've also got to consider what's going to be deliverable over the course of the coming year as well, because I think there also wouldn't be anything to gain from potentially having a massive increase to the budget, say, if that had been possible, for that money to then not be spent because there weren't the projects there to bring that forward. So we have to be careful about how that, about the allocations that are there, because obviously I think all of us would want to see that fully utilised going forward. So again, I realise that confidence has been dented. We want to try and repair that and build that again going forward. And I believe with the budget that we have before us, it is a step in the right direction.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. We're now going to move on to our third theme on Nature Scotland, a question from Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. Nature Scots received quite a significant budget cut in £10 million, or 12.8 cut in cash terms. I wonder if you could indicate what implications this will have across your portfolio.
I mean, the budget for Nature Scot doesn't fall within my portfolio, and I don't have overall responsibility for the agency. So I'm not too clear exactly what the implications for that would be. Now, of course, there is funding that we provide to Nature Scot, and mentioned through the agriculture, the Farming with Nature programme. That's funding that we would be providing specifically for that work to carry out if that goes, if that is to go ahead. So again, it's hard for me to provide more detail as to exactly what that would mean for Nature Scot, because I haven't had those discussions with them.
Have you had discussions with your colleague, your counterpart in Net Zero and Energy?
Not specifically in relation to the Nature Scot budget. I mean, obviously there are areas that impact my portfolio, as I've outlined. But again, I don't have the overall portfolio responsibility for Nature Scot, so it's hard for me to answer in any detail as to what the implications for that would be with them.
I suppose what I'm getting at is sort of peatland restoration and the funding for that.
Yes, so that's where we've had an increase in the peatland funding that's available, and we pay a number of different agencies who carry out that work on our behalf, so that's the National Parks and Nature Scot as well. So from our perspective, we're going to see an increase in the funding that's provided for peatland restoration over the coming year, which will enable us to restore more degraded peat. I think over the course of the past year, we've restored around 10,000 hectares. Obviously, we have a target of around 258,000 hectares to be restored, but and I think with the funding that we have available over the course of the coming year, that would lead to around 16,000 hectares potential to be restored.
I think it's important to have that confidence in the pipeline of funding coming through in terms of skills, and also for businesses who do the work.
You're absolutely right, and I think it's very similar actually to the conversation that we've just had on forestry, because peatland restoration is still relatively a young industry. We want to see that continuing to build and grow. We need the confidence to enable that to happen, and that means that we have to continue to provide the funding to enable that growth to take place, and exactly as you've said, to ensure that we've got the skills and that we are building the skills and the career opportunities and training opportunities through that as well. So I believe with the funding that we have available in the budget this year, again, it puts us in that positive space where we're able to restore more and hopefully continue to build that confidence in the industry.
Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary, I just want to make it or understand that Nature Scot, whilst it's not your overall responsibility, you've got to appreciate that Nature Scot is responsible through its licensing functioning, distribution of funds, and you've touched on peatland restoration and nature restoration, but also planning and advisory role, which do affect your portfolio in sectors such as agriculture and forestry, that it will have their ability to perform will have a significant impact on your portfolio. And given they've had a 12% cut in cash terms or 15% cut in real terms, what discussions do you have with your counterpart and the Cabinet Secretary for NZEC? Because obviously it has a massive impact on the ability to deliver on your ambitions.
Yes, and sorry, I think I just want to be clear. I mean, it's just that obviously in preparation for the Budget Committee appearance, I'm preparing for the scrutiny in the areas of my overall portfolio responsibility. And as I say, there are areas of funding that we transfer to Nature Scot. So I think I just wanted to be clear on that. I mean, I'm more than happy to follow up with the committee on more details as to what that's going to look like for Nature Scot. Because, of course, there are impacts across my portfolio and they deliver a number of important functions, and we do work closely with them as well. So I think I just wanted to be absolutely clear on that. But in terms of the absolute detail and how that's being managed for Nature Scot, again, that's just where I'm not able to answer that today, because I would still fully expect that with the funding that's being provided for my portfolio and for those specific functions where that has an impact, I would still expect that work to be undertaken as well. But I'm more than happy to follow up with the committee or with further information in relation to that.
Thank you, that'd be appreciated. We're now going to move on to our next theme 4, on fisheries. And first question from Tim Eagle.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Now, this is actually something that's quite of interest of me. I've been trying to do a wee bit of research into this. I'm getting increasingly worried about the Marine Directorate and its future, because, I mean, we heard this morning a wee bit of issues over salmon. I'm getting lots of conversations actually from the fishing industry about what the Directorate is doing. I wasn't here on this committee when you went and did your visit, but I heard that the facilities really aren't in a particularly good state. And all of this leads me to be very worried that actually the Marine Directorate just are not in a position to deliver the functions which are critical for Scotland. And I guess on top of that, they've had a budget cut last year, they've had another budget cut this year. So I guess the question is, how do you address the concerns that Marine Directorate's capacity to deliver those functions simply aren't possible within the context of a budget cut?
Right, I think you've raised a number of hugely important points within that. So, and I think there's a few things that I would want to touch on there. So I think what actually looks like, and again, it's the presentation of the figures, which I don't think has helped with this at all in any way, but I think what looks like an overall budget cut is based on the on-budget revision, and when you compare it to the original 24-25 budget as it was published, there's been a 1% increase in the funding. So I think I just want to be clear on that point, and it's more a presentational issue, again, because of the changes in the way that the budget has been presented. Now, I do believe that the Marine Directorate, and again, I was just on a visit up to Aberdeen recently to see, again, I have visited previously because I understand the concerns of the committee with the site in Aberdeen there, but they carry out vital functions for us in government, whether that's in relation to science, compliance, enforcement, and across a number of different areas, and all the work that's being undertaken in relation to the marine environment as well. And I do believe they undertake that role very well. And again, we are continuing to invest in the Marine Directorate as a whole. And I think touching on some of the issues that you've raised there in particular, we covered in some detail at the pre-budget committee, I think, the concerns of committee members around the estate in Aberdeen. And I'd outlined at that time that there was a project board that had been established to look at what the short-term measures could be for some of the issues at the site, look then to the medium term and the longer-term plans. And that work is still very much underway. I do think it's important to highlight, though, that as challenging as that the estate in Aberdeen is, there has been quite significant investment over the past few years. I think it's around £9 million has been spent on the estate. But of course, further work is planned over the course of the coming year as we then work towards those longer term solutions on the site as well. Of course, I did listen carefully to the evidence that the committee received and concerns around the concerns from a variety of different stakeholders. But again, we are continuing to invest in the Marine Directorate because of the vital function that they undertake. And again, we will continue to do that and invest in that going forward.
Ariane Burgess, a supplementary.
I don't need to do that one, but I can continue on.
Yes, please.
Thanks. Yeah. Cabinet Secretary, we are aware of multiple strands of work being carried out by the Marine Directorate, and some of the commitments for this session include the fisheries management measures for marine protected areas and the priority marine features. And we also have work that needs to be taken around fisheries stock assessments. I would like to understand if there's, I'd like an update on the marine protected areas work and the marine protected areas and the priority marine features work. Is there enough resource for this to, I think there's a commitment to get that in place by the end of this session. And also, is there enough resource in place for the fisheries stock assessment, and are those carried out by different teams? That would be interesting to understand.
Yes, I'll probably hand over to Ian in a minute. He'll be able to provide a bit further detail. I think in relation to the work on MPAs and the PMFs too, just to say that that is being led by the Net Zero portfolio, though it sits within the Marine Directorate. Now, as far as I understand, we obviously consulted last year on the offshore measures, and I think the results of that consultation are being analysed. And I think, as I said to the committee previously, it's not even necessarily, well, of course, there are resource pressures right across government when it comes to specific areas of work, but in relation to the inshore marine protected areas in the PMFs, that has taken a lot longer than anticipated, purely because it has been such a big and complex piece of work, because we're talking about over 160 different sites. So again, we've proceeded with the offshore element, but the work on the inshore element, I can't provide any more specific timeframes, I'm afraid, at the moment in relation to when that might come forward. But I think it's really just to emphasise that it is a really big, complex area and piece of work that is still very much ongoing. But I don't know if Ian has any further information that he'd like to add to that.
Yeah, I think, as Cabinet Secretary said, we're undertaking an analysis for the offshore MPAs at the moment, and we'll look to implement later this year. The onshore, with over 160 sites, is more complex, so we're just working through that now, and we can give a further update on the timeline that on due course. And I think that the other question you asked was on fisheries management and the strategy work was there. We'll be providing an update on all the actions we had undertaken on that in spring this year, along with the next steps that were taken on the fisheries management strategy.
Okay. Thanks very much for those responses. My question, the root of my question was, is there enough resource in both places to actually carry those commitments out? Is there enough funding in the budget? You're on, hang on a minute. We can't hear you yet.
Sorry about that. No, I think I was just going to make the point that, I mean, we have the overall allocation to the Marine Directorate. There are obviously different budget lines within that for the initial allocations. Ian will probably be able to give a bit more detail, but basically that will be, there are indicative allocations at the moment. There will then be more of, that'll be the starting point for business planning that will then take forward from that to look at, well, what are the key priorities and where does that resource best need to be placed. And I think we've said this before previously, but we're happy to provide the committee with further information on the internal allocations across each of the different portfolios within the Marine Directorate, if that would be helpful.
That would be welcome. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. I suppose just building on the issues, the issue around resourcing, we were told previously that restructuring and reducing staff costs had resulted in the number of full-time staff in the Marine Directorate falling from 825 in December 2022 to 760 in December 2023. Can you give an indication of where those, is that across the board, or are there any particular areas within the Marine Directorate that have seen the staff reduction? And obviously the implication, you know, the capacity that Marine Directorate has to deliver its remit is of concern.
Yes, well, I'll hand over to Ian, who will be able to give more information as to what that looks like. Obviously, that's more of a workforce question. I think it's more appropriate for him to answer. But I would say that there have been some, I think, just some more structural changes and transfers to other directorates. So it hasn't necessarily changed the work, but people have moved between directorates, which makes it appear as if there have been bigger changes than what there actually have been. But I would also say that one key area that I know the directorate is looking at, and I've seen some of these initiatives firsthand as well, is we're constantly looking at how we can improve, become more efficient, and looking at that wider transformation work as well. I think in my last appearance in the committee, when we were discussing some of these issues, talked about the use of drone technology as an example, which actually increases our capabilities and can help us in a number of different ways. But there have also been other areas that, when you consider onshore operations, so there's been an overall reduction there in resource of about 12%, but there's been a 39% increase in the overall inspections in port as well, because of the reprioritisation of workloads that's taken place within that as well. So I'll hand over to Ian, though, who'll be able to give a bit more information about the specifics on the workforce.
Thank you, and I'm happy to go through that. So, as Cabinet Secretary mentioned, from a Marine Directorate perspective, we're very much focused on our workforce planning and actually how do we get and efficiencies as we start to move forward. So I can give you some key headlines that maybe talk to the information you had from 2022 and some of the changes that happened then, and then a bit about what we're planning to do in future. So since 2022, we have had some short-term temporary work that has stopped, so that has resulted in some changes in our full-time equivalents. For example, we had 12 FTE in a Director IT project. That was external people coming in. That project successfully concluded, and that then stopped. We did have some FTE on our transformation work, starting to look at the structures and efficiencies we could get, and we've previously outlined to committee that restructure took place across the Directorate. There were, as Cabinet Secretary said, also structural changes within the Directorate. So with the creation of offshore wind, we saw 14 FTE move over to offshore wind. So that shows actually as a reduction in marine, but that work still happens within the Scottish Government just now within the offshore Directorate work. Cabinet Secretary mentioned those efficiencies within operations, some of that through digitisation, some of that through prioritisation as we start to go. That's really encouraging because we're also seeing an uplift in productivity at the same time. And we also continue to look at our annual delivery plan in terms of how we move forward. So things that we're starting to look at in the future years and develop a strategic workforce plan is to keep this theme of continuous improvement going through our organisation, so we continue to deliver value for money. So the drone trial was really successful last year off MPV Hirta. Start to look at how that can increase our capability, and we're just working through our business cases and next options on that, and we shall have some information in the coming months on that. I think committee are also aware of our science and innovation strategy. We're working with internal and external stakeholders on both the implementation plan and areas of research interest, and that is due to publish in April as well. So I hope that's helpful in terms of that question and that trajectory on workforce since 2022.
Thank you.
Tim Eagle.
Yeah, thank you. It's just in terms of the vessel replacement. Don't want to mention the dreaded word of ferries, although I just have. But it just, you know, making sure actually that we've got the vessels out there. You know, I know that there are, or some of the fishing industry are slightly worried about what's going on out at sea at the moment, and making sure that we're boarding the right boats and risk. And I know it's about risk, not nationality and all of that. But actually, do we have enough money in the budget fundamentally to ensure that we're continuing to replace the vessels or upgrade them where we need to make sure that our fleet and our aircraft, I think, is always ready to maintain our fishing sector?
Yes, you're absolutely right, because they're a vital component of our compliance and enforcement, and they do really important work. So I know the committee will be aware we have 3 marine protection vessels, we have 2 marine research vessels as well, and of course we have our aircraft and the inshore patrol vessels too. So of course investing in that fleet is hugely important, and like any vessel, it reaches an end of life stage. So the 2 that are closest to that are the MRV Scotia and the MPV Minna. So we're looking at a procurement exercise for those vessels and what that might look like. So I would just want to give an assurance that we are acutely aware of that and we are trying to prepare for the future. But also looking at, I mean, you know, I touched on in the previous answer how we can best utilise new technologies, and again, seeing the pilot that had been undertaken with the drone was really important, and I think that's a really vital capability that we could well bring forward and could very much help with compliance and enforcement going forward as well, because it is a vast marine area that we have to patrol. And yeah, I think looking at these other capabilities where we can best utilise new technologies is going to be really critical going forward, and really maximising the resources that we have. So again, I would just want to give an assurance on that front that that is very much at the forefront of our mind, and we are constantly looking to adapt and add to that.
Just a very, very quick follow-up. I don't disagree with your point. I think we should all, in all sectors, be looking at new technologies and emerging technologies to how we can help. But just to double-check that then, like, is there money in the budgets to do that, do you think? Like, in terms of using drone technology, whether that be water-based or airborne, you know, you're confident that the Marine Directorate have the funding to look into that?
Oh, to investigate that, yeah, we've already undertaken the pilot. So, of course, the evaluation of that pilot work is important to then see how we take that forward. But I don't have any concerns about the budget allocation that we have available for that. Okay. And again, when it comes to vessel procurement, that is a long lead-in time initially for that as well. But again, when it comes to these new technologies, I don't have any concerns about us being able to take forward that work.
Thank you.
Rhoda Grant, but just on the back of vessel replacement, we know if you run an organisation that has a minibus, you know after a certain time it's going to need replaced. So every year, part of you build up a reserve so that when the time comes that vessel needs replaced. You know, given that we have a static 7.3 million of capital budget for, you know, such as, you know, the marine labs and vessel running costs, is there a contingency fund? Is there a pot that's been built up with a view to these vessels being replaced as the time arrives for them to be replaced effectively?
Again, you're absolutely right. Everything approaches its end-of-life period, so that is what we are planning for at the moment. Now, of course, there are other costs that we have to bear within the budget, and I think some of the biggest increases that we've seen are in relation to fuel costs, which have risen dramatically and which can have that kind of a very big impact. And to give you an idea, if fuel goes up by 13 pence a litre, that's an extra £50,000 a month fuel cost for the vessels. So, of course, that is a cost and a control that we have to manage, and again plan for new vessels as the vessels that we currently have approach their end of service years.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Convener. The Cabinet Secretary will know that seafarers within the Marine Directorate are significantly underpaid compared to other seafarers employed by the Scottish Government. And I wonder if the budget allows for them to be brought into a par of people that work, for example, with CalMac, rather than being underpaid so significantly.
I'll have to ask Ian to provide more information on that.
Yep, happy to do so. So our marine pay negotiations are due to start in the coming months, so we can give further updates on that as they start to progress. We haven't seen significant uplifts in pay. The last pay deal agreed with the marine unions was a 2-year pay deal that will run out this year. That also included some reform options, which gave colleagues within the seafarers options to do call back on the vessels, which was very well received as well. So we can give further update as we start to progress through the marine negotiations, but from a budget point of view, we're content that there's sufficient money in the budget.
It would be useful just to see the comparisons with seafarers and CalMac and progress towards equality.
Thank you. Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, I'm interested in the Inshore Fisheries Management Improvement Programme. I think we call it, is it IFMI or IFMIP, something like that. Anyway, another acronym to add to our lives. Could you tell us if there's been an assessment of the anticipated costs of developing a new inshore fisheries framework under the IFMI to ensure that it's funded sufficiently?
Yes, we do have some wonderful acronyms, particularly across this portfolio. But I would say in relation to the programme of work for inshore fisheries, again, I think that costs will very much feature. I just don't think we're at that stage of the work at the moment. As the committee will already be aware, we've undertaken a call for evidence initially, so we're still very much at those early stages in relation to that work. But of course, any costs would feature as that work progresses.
Thank you. Emma Roddick now. Beg your pardon, Emma. Question 12, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I wanted to raise something that was brought up in last year's budget, that the Marine Directorate could maximise income generated through the likes of commercial science, licensing fees and energy consenting fees. Has there been an increase in these revenues as a result, and if so, how are they being reinvested?
I think we do seek to maximise income from these areas where we can, but I think I'll have to ask for Ian. I don't have the specific figures in front of me in relation to that. Ian, I don't know if you have that to hand.
I can give you the headline figures. So in the last year, there's been £9 million in total income to the Marine Directorate from the variety of different sources you've talked about. It. Some comes from our licensing functions, some comes from our science colleagues, some comes from using our aircraft as well. But we can follow up with a breakdown of that £9 million.
That would be helpful. And are there other options being explored around potential revenue raising that's not happening at the moment?
So on the science and innovation strategy, that is something that we'll pick up through the implementation plan and consider what options may be in future years from the science perspective there.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got a question. It was raised when the committee visited the marine labs in Aberdeen about how priorities are identified within the annual delivery plan, and I understand the annual delivery plan is currently being formulated and will be published in due course. Cabinet Secretary, you'll be delighted to hear I'm going to raise the topic of cockles, where we have a fishery which up to now has been almost entirely funded, or their work and stock assessment, whatever, have been funded via UK grant schemes or whatever, and facilitated by local fishermen and scientists. We have the situation at the moment where it's quite clear there is a economically viable cockle fishery based on vessels in the Solway. The element that's missing is how do these stakeholders, which includes the likes of South Scotland Enterprise Agency, who are interested in the economic sustainability of the region at Dumfries and Galloway, how do we trigger an investigation into including the likes of opening a new cockle fishery in the annual delivery plan, given that anything that I've certainly been provided with or is in the public domain, it would be cost neutral, in effect potentially generate over £3 million for the economy that the cockle fishery borders?
I mean, that's the thing. It's when there's discussions on the annual delivery plan, it's looking at the priorities in the coming year ahead and how to best allocate resources within that. But I mean, I know that we've had discussions on this previously, Convener. Again, I haven't received any final advice in relation to that on potential next steps there. But I think, as we'd said in previous conversations, that would feature in the wider discussion that we have about overall priorities. But I think it's important for that, for me to be in receipt of that advice first.
So how do you juggle the difference between national priorities and local priorities?
Well, again, it's all part of the discussions that we have as part of the overall resource allocation. It's looking at, I mean, I'd say that just because something is more of a local issue rather than a national one doesn't make it less important, because it can be very economically significant for a particular part of the country, which does make it important. But again, these are all part of the balanced discussions that have to take place.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. We're now going to move on to our final theme, Theme 5, which is on the islands, and we've got questions from Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, in terms of the £26 million spend on the Islands programme, can you say if it's had a positive impact on population levels in the islands and similarly on economic development?
I think in terms of a definitive connection or the exact statistics of what that would look like, I mean, I'm not too sure if I would be able to provide that information precisely, because I think that, well, what's important is that when we're looking at applications through the Islands programme, is that they meet the objectives that we have within the overall National Islands Plan across a number of different areas. And I would hope that through some of the programmes and projects that we've funded, that it would impact positively both on the economy and on local populations as well. I think the one that automatically springs to mind is a project that I visited in September in Orkney, visiting the new nursery that's being constructed there, and hearing about the positive impact that that's going to have for people when that's up and running as well. So I think the Islands programme has been able to fund specific initiatives that may not have taken place otherwise, that I do think have positive impacts on the economy as well as on populations. I mean, it's also helped fund various different projects on the islands, including whether that's temporary workers' accommodation, depending on the different needs of different communities. But I think in the time that we've had the Islands programme in operation over the course of the past few years, I think there have been over 70 projects across 50 different islands, and I do believe as a whole they have had a positive impact.
Just in terms of the Islands Plan and the review that was carried out, looking at 11 of the 13 objectives, the majority of respondents thought there'd been no progress on Objective 3 on transport, and also the one on fuel poverty.
I mean, we listened really carefully to the outcomes of that consultation and to what islanders are saying about the new National Islands Plan. So, of course, all of that will be taken into consideration because we're in the process, as the committee will be aware, of developing a new National Islands Plan and considering how that can be best updated and to reflect what the needs of island communities are. So, and there will, of course, be further engagement on that as we go forward. But I do think we have to listen carefully to what islanders are telling us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, while there is undoubtedly positivity in the islands about the funding that's been made available through the Islands Plan, I know that the committee's heard concerns from some local authorities about the competitive bidding approach. It's something I've raised in the past, and projects in the Shetland Islands and Highland Council areas have all raised with me that they don't want to be competing against each other, and that maybe making these allocations to the authorities to then distribute might be a better way forward. So will future Islands Plan funding use that same approach?
Well, one thing I would say that is, I think, really important is that I know that the committee has scrutinised this over the course of the past few years. We have listened really carefully to all the recommendations that the committee have made on the back of that as to how we can improve how we're allocating that funding, the makeup of the programme board, and very much listened and taken that feedback and acted on it as well. It is always really difficult when it comes to either a direct allocation or a competitive bid model, and there's no getting around it, because in either one, if you directly allocate, it naturally means there's not as much money to, or it can be smaller pots going to different islands, which means that they may not then be able to consider bigger projects going forward because there wouldn't be the level of funding there to support that. And those are just part of the trade-offs that you have when you're considering the two different models. So we've retained the competitive bid model and refined that over the course of the past couple of years, because we believe that, while I completely understand that some local authorities can see that they might lose out in one round, it does allow bigger projects to proceed that may not have gone ahead otherwise. And I think that it does enable a greater variety of projects too through the competitive bid model that we have. And it's been, Scottish Future Trust have undertaken a lot of work working with local authorities as well in terms of the preparation for those projects and looking at that wider pipeline that can come through as well. So I do believe that we have acted on the advice that we've received from the committee. I think that the competitive bid model that we have is the one that's most appropriate at the moment. But again, if the committee has any specific feedback in relation to that, I'm more than happy to take that on board and consider it for the future. But I think some of these projects have been big. I think they've been hugely important, and I think that we probably have the right model in place at the moment.
Thank you.
Rhoda Grant.
Can I ask about kind of cross-cutting government? Because you're responsible for the Islands programmes, indeed the Islands Act, and really trying to kind of level the playing field between islands and the mainland. And yet we see in other budgets, for instance, local government, 2 out of our 3 island authorities facing cuts since since 13-14, with Éileann Shear having an 18% cut in their budget. So it seems to me that you're looking at getting funds in place to help islands where other departments are having no cognizance of that whatsoever and cutting budgets, I would say, making your job harder.
No, I would say that, it's a responsibility of all parts of government and all the relevant authorities to undertake island communities impact assessments, or where it's believed that there would be a disproportionate impact on our island communities. So that's work that would very much be undertaken. And again, the government is vast, and while I have that cross-coordination role, and I'm supported by the Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity in relation to that as well, we're supported by a team of islands officials who work across government and with different departments as well to really embed that and to ensure that our island communities are always taken into consideration. I don't think it's fair to say that this portfolio cares about islands and other ones don't. I think you've picked one specific example there, and I don't have all the figures or how that's been or how that's been devised there. But I would say that, this portfolio isn't only the responsible portfolio for investing in islands, or in fact in rural communities as well. I mean, just even remembering earlier when I mentioned the climate funding, there's funding within that that sits with the NZ portfolio. It's distributed through, it'll be transferred to the transport portfolio, and there are specific projects there which are set to benefit rural and island communities as well. So again, there's right across government and right across other portfolios, there are funds, there are infrastructure projects that are being undertaken that deliver on that. But that's where I also think the work that's undertaken and the work that we have through the National Islands Plan is also really helpful in pulling all of that together, because it's about showing how other parts of government, what we're doing across government to deliver for our island communities. And that's where I think it's also really important, the work that we're taking forward on the refresh of the National Islands Plan as well, to make sure that we have identified what are the most pressing challenges for island communities and taking action to address them.
So would an island's impact assessment have been carried out on those budget cuts to local government?
Again, I would expect that island community impact assessments is part of the work that government does. So where there's a disproportionate impact, then those impact assessments should be undertaken, much in the same way as we do BRIA's equality impact assessments, fairer funding. So I expect that would form part of what portfolios are looking at.
I guess we're really looking for confirmation that those impact assessments were done rather than they should have been done.
Again, I don't have them in front of me, but I would expect that work would have been done.
Thank you.
I can follow up with the committee and provide confirmation.
Okay, that would be appreciated. Cabinet Secretary, I don't believe we have any other questions other than probably need to ask, just for transparency and for the record, what's your favourite acronym from the portfolio?
Well, I don't know. IFNI is the one that's closest to my mind, so I think that'll be the new one.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, we very much appreciate, because we know you're under the weather today, so it's been a bit of a mammoth session with salmon and the budget, so we appreciate your efforts today and those of your officials. So thank you very much for attending. That concludes our business for today, and I now close this meeting.
Thank you.